A 17-year-old girl pulls a burned helmet from the bottom of a junkyard crushing pile. Hanging from its shattered chin strap is a bent aluminum tag, engraved with a dead man's serial number. She walks into a roadside diner full of bikers and holds it up like a trophy. One man goes white because that tag was supposed to be 6 feet underground, buried with the body, buried with the lie. Someone dug it out, someone hid it, and now a girl who survives on scrap metal is holding 15 years of silence in her palm, and she doesn't even know people have been killed to keep that tag from ever being found. Stay with me until the very end of this one. Hit that like button, drop a comment, tell me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The junkyard had no name. Not anymore. Whatever faded lettering once hung above its chain-link gates had rusted into brown streaks years ago, eaten by Midwest winters and summers that nobody asked for. The signposts remained, two bent steel poles leaning toward each other like drunks holding a conversation neither could finish. Between them, nothing. Just sky the color of old dishwater and the smell of oxidized iron rising from 3 acres of compressed automobiles stacked 4 high. Mara Ellison walked through the gap where the gate used to lock, her grandfather's bolt cutters hanging from a carabiner on her belt loop. She was 17. Thin. Not the kind of thin that came from choosing salads, the kind that came from choosing between lunch and bus fare, and picking bus fare 3 days out of 5. Her dark hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found on the sidewalk outside a post office 2 towns over. Her boots were men's size 8, 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper at the toes. They had been her grandfather's before his left foot started dragging and he couldn't walk the yards anymore. She carried a magnet on a stick. That was her technology. Her grandfather called it the honest detector because it never lied about what was steel and what was aluminum, what was worth dragging home, and what would cost more in gas than the scrapyard would pay. The afternoon light came in low and cold. November in Ridgehaven, Ohio meant the kind of air that sat in your chest like a fist. Mara had learned not to breathe through her mouth out here. The metallic taste coated your tongue and stayed for hours, mixing with whatever you ate for dinner until everything tasted like pennies and regret. She worked the northwest corner first. That was where the newest wrecks landed before the crusher got to them. Most of the good copper had been stripped already by the yard's own crew, but they were lazy about motorcycles. Bikes got shoved to the edges, piled between sedans and minivans like afterthoughts. Nobody wanted to crawl under a flattened Buick to reach a Harley frame that might yield $8 worth of wiring. Mara did. $8 was $8. She found the helmet 40 minutes into the crawl. It was wedged beneath a compressed pickup truck, half buried in frozen mud and shattered glass. The shell was black, or had been before fire turned most of it into a blistered, peeling landscape of char and exposed fiberglass. The visor was gone except for a jagged triangle still clinging to the left hinge. The interior foam had melted and rehardened into something that looked like diseased coral. She almost left it. Helmets weren't worth anything at the scrap counter. But the chin strap caught the light. Hanging from its broken buckle was a small aluminum tag, bent nearly in half, swinging in the wind that pushed through the wreckage. She reached for it. The metal was cold enough to sting. She turned it over. On one side, a stamped serial number, partially melted but still readable. On the other side, a single word etched by hand, not by machine. Knox. She ran her thumb over the letters. They were rough, carved with something sharp. A nail, maybe, or a knife point. Someone had wanted this word on this tag badly enough to do it by hand. Mara pocketed the tag and dragged the helmet out by its remaining strap. She didn't know why. She'd tell herself later it was because the tag looked cool. That was the version she'd repeat at dinner. The truth was something she couldn't name, a pull in her sternum. A quiet alarm that said this thing mattered more than its weight in scrap aluminum. She didn't know she was holding a dead man's name. She didn't know the dead man wasn't dead. The walk back to her grandfather's truck took 20 minutes through the yard's access road, past the office trailer where a man named Dale Purcell sat behind clouded plexiglass and weighed whatever people dragged in. Dale was 50-something, heavy, with the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from parts that didn't quite match. Eyes too small, jaw too wide, nose broken so many times it pointed in a direction that had nothing to do with the rest of his head. He wore a Carhartt jacket stained with hydraulic fluid and never looked directly at anyone under 25. Mara loaded her haul onto the scale. 43 pounds of mixed ferrous. Dale punched numbers into a calculator that had a cracked screen and a missing equals button. He'd memorized the math years ago. The calculator was just theater. $19 and change, he said. Want cash or credit toward next load? Cash. He counted out a 10, a 5, and 4 ones. The change he kept. Mara didn't argue. Arguing with Dale cost more than the coins were worth. She almost walked out without saying anything. Should have. Later she'd think about that moment. Her hand on the trailer door, her boots already turning toward the parking lot. 1 second, 1 breath. That's all of the distance between the life she had and the life that was about to swallow her. Hey, Dale. He didn't look up. You know anything about a motorcycle helmet? Black shell, burned pretty bad, had an aluminum tag on the strap? Dale's pen stopped moving. Not dramatically, just a pause. The kind of pause a man makes when his brain sends a signal to his hand faster than his face can catch up. No. It was under a truck, northwest corner. Don't know about it. The tag says Knox. Now Dale looked up. His eyes did something Mara had never seen before. They went flat. Not angry, not scared, just empty, like someone had pulled the plug on whatever powered the man behind them. You should put that back, he said. Why? Because it ain't yours. It was in the crush pile. That makes it scrap. Some scrap ain't worth carrying. He looked back down at his paperwork. Conversation over. Mara stood there for 3 seconds, 4, 5, long enough to feel the temperature in the trailer drop in a way that had nothing to do with November. Then she left. She didn't put it back. Her grandfather was asleep in the truck when she reached the lot. Walt Ellison, 71, ex-steelworker, current recipient of a disability check that covered rent and half the electric bill. The other half came from Mara's scrap runs. He'd fallen asleep with the engine running and the heater on low, his head tilted against the window at an angle that would punish his neck for the next 2 days. His hands rested on his thighs, knuckles swollen, fingers curved inward from decades of gripping things that fought back. Steel tongs, rivet guns, his dead wife's hospital bed rails. Mara opened the driver's door quietly and slid behind the wheel. She'd been driving since she was 14. No license. Walt had taught her in a church parking lot on Sunday mornings when nobody was around, both of them pretending the lessons were about freedom instead of necessity. Get anything good? Walt murmured without opening his eyes. $19. That'll do. She pulled the helmet from behind the seat and set it on the console between them. Walt opened one eye. The hell is that? Found it in the pile. Got a tag on it. Walt sat up slowly. He picked up the helmet the way he picked up everything. Carefully, like the world was made of things that could cut you if you weren't paying attention. He turned the tag over. Knox, he read, then again quieter. Knox. He set the helmet down. Means nothing to me. Dale got weird when I asked about it. Dale's weird about everything. This was different. Walt looked at his granddaughter. 17 years of raising her after his daughter's overdose and his son-in-law's disappearance had taught him to recognize when Mara had her teeth in something. She had her mother's stubbornness without the self-destruction, a combination that terrified him daily. Let it go, Mara. Grandpa, I said let it go. She drove them home in silence. Home was a 2-bedroom rental on Harker Street, 3 blocks from the river, in a neighborhood where the streetlights worked on alternating blocks, and the city had stopped replacing the ones that burned out. The house smelled like coffee and liniment and the particular staleness of rooms where the windows hadn't been opened since September. Mara put the helmet in her closet. She told herself she was done with it. She wasn't. 3 days later, she was back at the junkyard, not for scrap, for answers. She'd spent 2 nights staring at the tag, running her fingers over the hand-carved letters, searching the serial number online and finding nothing. No registration, no recall notices, no manufacturer database that matched the format. The number was structured wrong, too many digits with a dash placement that didn't correspond to any helmet certification system she could find. It wasn't a product serial number, it was something else, something personal. Dale wasn't in the office when she arrived. A younger guy she didn't recognize was working the scale. Mid-20s, nervous energy, kept checking his phone like he was waiting for a text that would either save him or bury him. "Where's Dale?" Called out. "He's sick?" "Don't know. I'm just covering." Mara walked the yard. The northwest corner looked different. The truck she'd crawled under was gone, crushed and chipped since her last visit. But so were 4 other vehicles that had been nowhere near ready for the crusher. She noticed the gaps the way you notice a missing tooth in a smile. The shape was wrong, the spacing was off, and the ground where they'd sat was scraped clean, not naturally. Someone had taken a front loader to this section and erased it. Her stomach dropped. She walked to the office trailer and checked the intake log that Dale kept pinned to a clipboard by the door. The last 3 pages were missing. Torn out, not neatly. Ragged edges still clung to the rings. The new guy watched her from behind the counter. "You can't be back here," he said. "I was just looking at the log." "Yeah, you can't do that either." Mara left. She sat in her grandfather's truck in the parking lot and called the number she'd seen on a business card pinned to the diner corkboard 3 weeks ago, a number for motorcycle repair that also, according to the faded handwriting, did custom exhaust work and historical restorations. The card had a small logo in the corner, a set of wings wrapped around a simple cross shape, not the kind from a church, the kind from a compass. 4 points. It was the mark of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, though Mara didn't know that yet. A woman answered on the 6th ring. Her voice was the texture of gravel and cigarette smoke. "Creed's shop. I'm looking for someone who knows about old motorcycle helmets." "Old how?" 15 years old, maybe more. It's burned, has a tag I can't identify." Silence. Then, "Where'd you find it?" "Purcell's yard, out on Route 9. More silence. Longer this time. Mara could hear breathing, a radio playing something with heavy bass, and the distant crack of a pneumatic wrench. "Come to the shop. Don't go back to that yard." "Why not?" "Because I said so. Corner of Mill and Davis. Ask for Silas." The line went dead. Mara drove to Mill and Davis with the helmet on the passenger seat, the tag swinging from the strap every time she hit a pothole. The shop was set back from the road behind a gravel lot where 8 motorcycles sat in a loose row. Heavy machines, all of them, built for distance and weather and the kind of riding that left bugs in your teeth and rain in your bones. The building itself was cinder block and corrugated steel, painted flat black a long time ago. A hand-lettered sign above the bay doors read, "Creed Custom Cycles." No phone number, no hours, no welcome mat. She parked and sat for a full minute. The air smelled like 2-stroke exhaust and wet concrete. Through the open bay, she could see a man working on a stripped-down engine block, his hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from doing something 10,000 times. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested he forgot meals rather than skipped them. His hair was gray at the temples, dark everywhere else, tied back with a leather cord. His forearms carried tattoos that disappeared into rolled sleeves, and his knuckles were scarred in patterns that spoke of decades of wrenches and fists. He didn't look up when Mara walked in. "I called about the helmet," she said. "I know." His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. "Set it on the bench." She did. He still didn't look at it. He finished torquing whatever he was torquing, set the wrench down, wiped his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his hands, and then turned. He looked at the helmet, and the color drained from his face so completely that Mara took a step backward. "Where?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a sound that came from somewhere behind his ribs. "Where did you get this?" "The Junkyard, Purcell's. It was under a—" "I know where Purcell's is." His hand was shaking. Not much. A tremor. The kind you'd miss if you weren't standing 3 feet away in a quiet shop with nothing between you and the truth. He reached for the tag. His fingers touched the aluminum and stopped. He closed his eyes. His jaw worked beneath his skin like he was chewing on words he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. "You know what this is," Mara said. Silas Creed opened his eyes. They were the color of creek water in December. Gray, cold, carrying things that had settled to the bottom a long time ago and stayed there. This tag belonged to a man named Ryder Knock. Who's Ryder Knox? He was my brother, not by blood, by everything else. Was? He died 15 years ago. Motorcycle accident on the interstate, fire. They said the bike hit a guardrail at 70 and the tank ruptured. Closed casket. They buried what was left. Mara looked at the tag. Then how is this here? Silas didn't answer immediately. He picked up the helmet now, holding it the way Walt held things. It's straight carefully, like it could cut. He turned it, examining the burn patterns, the shattered visor, the melted foam. His hands knew this shape. She could see it in the way his fingers found the contours, like a blind man reading a face he'd memorized. This tag was supposed to be inside that casket, Silas said quietly. I watched them lower it. I threw dirt on the lid. I stood in the rain until everyone else left, and I stood there another hour after that. Maybe they made a duplicate. You don't duplicate these. Each one is hand-stamped with a unique sequence by the writer. Ryder carved his own name into this. I watched him do it the night before he left for the ride that killed him. The shop went quiet. Even the pneumatic wrench in the back bay had stopped. Mara became aware of other presences. 2 men in the doorway of an adjoining room, watching. Neither spoke. One leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, a cigarette burning between 2 fingers. The other stood straight, hands at his sides, his expression unreadable beneath a dark beard that covered most of his jaw. Silas set the helmet down. When he looked at Mara again, something in his eyes had changed. The grief was still there, but now it had company, a sharpness, a focus, the kind of look a man gets when he realizes the ground he's been standing on for 15 years is not the ground at all. "How much you want for it?" he asked. "It's not for sale." "Everything at that yard is for sale. You said so yourself." "I said I found it in the crush pile. I didn't say I wanted to sell it." A ghost of something crossed Silas's face. Not a smile. Not quite. Something older, something that recognized a kind of stubbornness he'd seen before. "Then why'd you bring it here?" Mara looked at the men in the doorway, at the motorcycles outside, at the tools hanging from the pegboard walls in neat rows that spoke of discipline and ritual. She looked at Silas Creed, a man whose hands shook at the sight of a dead friend's tag. "Because Dale Purcell turned into a different person when I showed it to him. Because 3 pages of the intake log are missing. Because 5 vehicles that weren't scheduled for the crusher got crushed the day after I pulled this out. And because someone carved their own name into a piece of aluminum before they died. And I don't think that's something you just throw away." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed against the walls. It sat on the workbenches. It filled the spaces between the motorcycles outside until the whole block felt like it was holding its breath. Silas reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out $300, more cash than Mara had seen in one place in months, and set it on the bench next to the helmet. "I'm not buying the helmet," he said. "I'm buying your time. You don't go back to that yard, not today, not tomorrow, not next week. You take this money, you go home, and you forget about Dale Purcell and crushed trucks and missing log pages." Mara didn't touch the money. "What are you afraid of?" "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm afraid for you. There's a difference. Who would care about a 15-year-old helmet? Whoever made sure it ended up in a crush pile instead of a display case or a memorial, or anywhere a human being might actually look at it and start asking questions." He picked up the money and held it out to her. His hand was steady now. Whatever tremor had shaken him earlier was gone, replaced by something harder, something that Mara recognized because she'd seen it in her grandfather after the mill closed. The particular rigidity of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. "Please," he said. And the word sounded foreign in his mouth, like a tool he hadn't used in years and wasn't sure still worked. Mara took the money, not because she was scared, not because she was convinced, because there was something in the way Silas Creed said please that told her he had buried more people than a man should have to bury, and she didn't want to add to the list. She left the shop. Silas waited until her truck pulled out of the lot before he moved. Then he crossed to the back room where the two men still stood. "Close the bay doors," he said. The bearded man, Graves, the club's sergeant-at-arms, moved without asking why. The other, Finch, who served as the club's road captain and unofficial historian, stubbed his cigarette against the doorframe and flicked it into a coffee can. "That was Ryder's lid," Finch said. "Not a question." "Yeah." "How?" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Silas laid the helmet under a fluorescent shop light and pulled a magnifying loupe from his tool drawer. The serial number was partially melted, but he could read the first 8 digits. He cross-referenced them against a battered notebook he kept in a locked drawer, a notebook that contained the personal identification codes of every Iron Saints member going back 30 years. The number matched. RK 4000-47109. Ryder Knox. Issued September of the year he prospected into the club. But there was something else. Around the edges of the tag, visible only under magnification, were tiny scratches, parallel lines, evenly spaced, the kind left by precision pliers or a jeweler's tool. These weren't damage marks, they weren't wear patterns, they were deliberate. Someone had gripped this tag with a tool and removed it from something, then reattached it, then removed it again. The tag had been handled multiple times, after the crash, after the funeral, after the casket went into the ground. Silas set the loop down. His hands were shaking again. He pressed them flat against the workbench until the tremor stopped, until the steel beneath his palms absorbed whatever was trying to escape from inside his chest. Ryder Knox had been a combat medic, just like Silas. They'd served in the same unit, stitched the same wounds, carried the same bodies, and come home to the same silence that no one outside the wire could understand. They'd found the Iron Saints together, not because they wanted to be outlaws, but because the club's founder, a man named Bishop, had built it as a place where men who couldn't stop hearing gunfire could sit in a room with other men who couldn't stop hearing gunfire, and nobody had to explain why they flinched at backfiring engines or slept with the lights on. Ryder had been the better man. Silas knew that. Everyone knew it. Ryder volunteered at the veterans' shelter. Ryder rebuilt engines for single mothers who couldn't afford mechanics. Ryder restored an abandoned chapel on the county road. Not because he believed in what chapels were for, but because he believed in the idea that some structures deserve to stand even when everyone has abandoned them. And then Ryder died. A highway crash on a Tuesday night in October. Fire, impact. A closed casket that weighed wrong. Silas had noticed that, had thought about it at 2 a.m. for years afterward, had told himself it was grief playing tricks because grief does that. Grief takes the plausible and makes it suspicious. Grief turns every shadow into a hiding place. But the tag was here. The tag was not in the casket. The tag had tool marks on it, and a girl had just told him that the man who ran the junkyard where she found it had turned to stone at the sound of the name Knox. Silas pulled his phone from his vest pocket and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Bishop," he said when the line connected. "It's Creed. I need a sit-down. Tonight." "What's wrong?" "Ryder might not be dead." The line went quiet for 7 seconds. Silas counted. 7 seconds of a 70-year-old man deciding whether the voice on the other end of the phone had finally broken or finally woken up. "My shop. 9 o'clock. Bring the proof." Silas hung up. He looked at Graves and Finch. "Nobody goes near that girl," he said, "and nobody goes near Purcell's yard. Not until we know what we're walking into." Graves nodded. Finch was already reaching for his phone to make calls Silas hadn't asked him to make, but both of them knew needed making. 11 miles away, Mara Ellison sat at her grandfather's kitchen table counting $300 she couldn't explain and staring at the grease stain on her palm where she'd held a dead man's tag. A dead man whose tag shouldn't exist outside a grave, whose name turned a junkyard owner's blood cold, and whose story had just put cracks in the face of a biker who looked like he hadn't cracked in decades. She picked up her phone and opened a browser. She typed, "Motorcycle accident fire Ohio Interstate 15 years ago." She got 47 results. None of them mentioned anyone named Knox, not one, as if the crash that supposedly killed him had never happened at all. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rust and frozen river water through the gap beneath the kitchen door. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, long, flat, disappearing into the dark like a warning that arrived too late for anyone to hear. Mara closed the browser. She opened it again. She typed, "Purcell Salvage Yard Vehicle Transfer Records." The search returned a single hit, a county business filing from 9 years ago listing Purcell's salvage and recovery as a subsidiary of a company called Meridian Asset Recovery Group. Mara had never heard of it, but when she clicked the filing, the listed principal officer's name made her stop breathing. It wasn't Dale Purcell. It was a name she recognized from the news, from the billboards on Route 9, from the television commercials that ran during every football game in the Tri-County area. A name that belonged to one of the most respected businessmen in Ridgehaven, a man who sat on the city council, who funded the volunteer fire department, who had personally donated the land where they built the memorial for victims of highway fatalities, and whose salvage company, according to this single forgotten filing, had been quietly processing wrecked motorcycles through Dale Purcell's yard for over a decade. Motorcycles that, if Mara's gut was right, included the one that supposedly burned with Ryder Knox inside it. She closed the laptop. Her hands were trembling now, just like Silas Creed's had trembled when he touched the tag. The same tremor, the same cause, the ground shifting beneath your feet when you realize the story you've been told, the story everyone has been told, is missing pages. $300 sat on the table. A dead man's name sat in her pocket. And somewhere in Ridgehaven, someone had spent 15 years making sure a burned helmet never surfaced, a serial number never got read, and a 17-year-old girl never walked into a biker shop and said the word that no one was supposed to say ever again. Knox. The sit-down happened at 9:14, not 9 o'clock. 14 minutes late because Bishop didn't move fast for anyone anymore, and because the kind of news Silas carried deserved the extra minutes of silence before it landed. Bishop's shop was not the Iron Saints official clubhouse. That building had been condemned 6 years ago after a water main broke beneath the foundation and the city refused to issue repair permits. The real reason was a zoning board member who didn't want motorcycles parked on his side of town, but the paperwork said water damage and paperwork always won. So Bishop ran the club's business from the back of a transmission repair garage on Carver Street, a place that smelled like gear oil and burnt clutch plates, and the particular brand of instant coffee that only exists in places where nobody has time to care about coffee. Silas arrived with the helmet in a canvas duffel bag. Graves drove. Finch rode shotgun with his window cracked despite the cold, cigarette smoke trailing behind the truck like a gray ribbon unraveling into the dark. 4 men were already inside when they walked in. Bishop sat at the center of a folding table that had been dragged from a storage closet, his wheelchair locked at an angle that allowed him to see both the door and the back exit simultaneously. 70 years old, Vietnam veteran, 2 Purple Hearts, a spinal injury from a wreck in 1994 that took his legs but not his authority. His face was a topographic map of scar tissue and sun damage, deep lines cut from his nose to the corners of his mouth like parentheses around a sentence no one had finished writing. His eyes were black, not dark brown, black, the way river stones are black after decades of current. To his left sat a man called Dutch, the club's treasurer, who had not spoken more than 12 consecutive words in any conversation Silas could remember. Dutch communicated in nods, grunts, and a system of finger taps on whatever surface was in front of him that the older members understood like Morse code. To Bishop's right sat Cora Vance, not a member. Women didn't patch into the Iron Saints, but the club's attorney for 22 years, and the only person in the room who had seen the inside of a courtroom more times than the inside of a bar. She was 58, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the posture of someone who had learned long ago that men in leather vests listened harder when you sat straighter than they did. The fourth man was someone Silas hadn't expected. Deacon Harrell. Deacon had been Ryder Knox's sponsor when Ryder prospected into the club. He was the man who vouched for Ryder, trained him, rode with him, and, according to everything Silas believed for 15 years, identified Ryder's remains after the crash. Deacon was 51 now, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a beard that had gone from brown to iron gray in the years since the funeral. He sat in the corner farthest from the light, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from, his eyes fixed on the duffel bag in Silas's hand. "Sit down," Bishop said. Silas sat. He placed the duffel on the table, but didn't open it. "Talk," Bishop said. Silas told them everything. The girl, the junkyard, the tag, the tool marks, Dale Purcell's reaction, the missing log pages, the crushed vehicles that shouldn't have been crushed. He spoke for 6 minutes without interruption, his voice flat, clinical, the way he used to deliver field reports when he was still in uniform, and the difference between emotion and information was the difference between someone living and someone bleeding out on a stretcher. When he finished, he unzipped the bag and set the helmet on the table. Nobody moved. Bishop leaned forward in his wheelchair. The leather of his vest creaked. He didn't touch the helmet. He looked at it the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he buried, with recognition, and with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing something that should no longer exist. "Deacon," Bishop said without looking away from the helmet, "you identified the body. I identified what they showed me." Every head in the room turned. Deacon's voice was low, rough, scraped raw by something that wasn't cigarettes. He set the coffee mug down. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath his beard like cables under tension. "What does that mean?" Silas said. "It means they brought me to the morgue. It means they pulled back a sheet. It means what was under that sheet was burned past recognition, and they pointed at it and said, 'This is your boy.' And I said, 'Yes,' because what else was I supposed to say?" "You were supposed to say the truth." The truth was a burned body in a drawer that was the right height and the right build, and was wearing the right boots and the right belt buckle. The truth was the coroner telling me dental records confirmed it. The truth was a highway patrol report with Ryder's plate number and Ryder's VIN and Ryder's insurance card melted to the dashboard of a bike that was nothing but frame and char. And you didn't question any of that. I questioned all of it, every night. For 15 years, Deacon's voice cracked. Not dramatically, a hairline fracture, the kind you hear in concrete before the slab splits. "You think I slept after that? You think I went home and made dinner and watched the game? I sat in my garage for 3 months. I didn't ride. I didn't eat right. I lost 40 pounds and my wife and my house in that order, and I never told anyone why because the why was just a feeling, just a sick feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away." "A feeling isn't silent," Silas said. "A feeling is something you bring to the table. You bring it here. You bring it to me. You don't carry it alone for 15 goddamn years while I'm standing at a grave every October throwing dirt on a lie." The room cracked open with those words. Not loudly. The way ice cracks on a pond. A single line running from shore to shore, splitting the surface without making a sound, and everyone on both sides suddenly realizing the ground they're standing on is not solid. Deacon looked at Silas. His eyes were wet, but nothing fell. Men like Deacon had learned to hold water behind walls built from scar tissue and silence, and those walls held until they didn't, and when they didn't, the flood took everything. "I was scared," Deacon said. 2 words. The most dangerous 2 words a man in that room could say, because fear in the Iron Saints wasn't a feeling. It was a question. It asked, "What are you protecting? Yourself or someone else?" And the answer determined whether the fear was cowardice or vigilance, and the line between those 2 things was thinner than the edge of the knife Silas could feel pressing against the inside of his ribs. "Scared of what?" Bishop asked. His voice carried no judgment. It carried weight, the kind of weight that compressed the air and made everyone else's breathing sound too loud. Scared that if I said something, whoever killed Ryder would come for the rest of us. Scared that the accident wasn't an accident and the body wasn't his body, and the whole thing was built by someone who had the resources to build it clean enough to fool a coroner and a highway patrol and a county prosecutor's office. Deacon paused. His fingers tightened around the mug. And scared that if I was right, if Ryder was murdered and replaced and erased, then it meant someone in this town had the power to make a man disappear completely. And I didn't know who that someone was. I still don't. Silas stood up. His chair scraped against the concrete floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. He walked to the far wall, pressed both palms flat against the cinder block, and stood there with his back to the room. His shoulders were rigid. The muscles along his spine were visible through his shirt, knotted and hard. The body of a man holding himself together through sheer mechanical force. 30 seconds passed. A minute. "Creed," Bishop said, "don't. Sit down. I stood at that grave, Bishop, every year. I talked to a stone. I told that stone things I never told anyone alive. I told it about the nightmares and the drinking and the 3 times I almost ate my own gun. I told a rock in the ground that I was sorry I wasn't there that night, that I should have ridden with him, that if I'd been on that highway, maybe I could have—" His voice broke. He pressed his forehead against the wall. The cold of the cinder block seeped into his skin. And the whole time, the man who was supposed to have my back was sitting in his garage knowing it might be a lie, and he said nothing. "I didn't know," Deacon said. "I suspected. There's a difference." Silas turned around. "There's no difference, not to me." Cora Vance cleared her throat. It was a small sound, but it carried the authority of 22 years of managing rooms full of men whose emotions ran hotter than their engines. "We can do this later," she said. "The blame, the grief, the accounting of who owed what to whom. We can do all of that after we know what we're actually dealing with." She looked at the helmet. "Silas, the tool marks. Walk me through them." He returned to the table. He pulled the magnifying loupe from his vest pocket and handed it to Cora. She examined the tag for 2 full minutes, turning it under the fluorescent light, her face betraying nothing. "These are consistent with needle-nose pliers," she said. "Multiple applications, at least 3 different grip patterns, which suggests either 3 different people handled this tag or one person handled it on 3 separate occasions over time." "Why would someone remove a tag from a helmet multiple times?" Finch asked from the doorway. "Because the helmet was being moved," Cora said. "And every time it was moved, someone had to decide whether to leave the tag on or take it off. The tag is identifiable. It connects the helmet to a specific person. If you're trying to make that person disappear, you remove the tag. If you're storing the helmet where no one will look, you put the tag back." "Why not just destroy the tag?" Graves said. "Because destroying evidence is a different crime than concealing it. And because whoever was handling this was careful, methodical. They weren't panicking, they were managing." The word sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Managing. It implied structure, planning, an ongoing operation, not a single act of violence. Bishop rolled his wheelchair forward until he was close enough to touch the helmet. He didn't. He looked at the serial number, then at Silas. "You matched it. RK 4470109. It's Ryder's. And the girl, the one who found it, where is she now?" "Home. I paid her to stay away from the yard." "You paid her." Bishop's tone shifted. Not anger. Something more precise. Disappointment, maybe. Or the particular frustration of a man who has taught his people 1,000 lessons and just watched one of them forget the most important one. "You gave a 17-year-old girl money and told her to forget." "I told her to stay safe. You told her to stop asking questions." "That's not the same thing. That's what they do, whoever they are. They tell people to stop asking questions, and they use money or fear or both. And the questions don't stop. They just go underground where nobody can see them until they surface in the worst possible place at the worst possible time." Silas said nothing. He knew Bishop was right. He'd known it the moment Mara had refused to touch the $300, had looked at him with eyes that were too old for 17 and too sharp for the kind of world that preferred its teenagers dull and compliant. "She'll go back to the yard," Finch said. "Girl like that, she'll go back." I know, Silas said. Then you need to get to her before whoever cleaned that yard does. Silas looked at Deacon. The question he wanted to ask was not the question that came out, but both of them knew it was the same question wearing different clothes. When you went to the morgue, Silas said, who called you? Highway Patrol. Which officer? Deacon closed his eyes. 15 years of trying to forget, and now being asked to remember, and the machinery of memory grinding against rust and resistance. Sergeant named Waller, Ben Waller, worked the Ridgehaven corridor. Is he still on the force? Retired, 6 years ago, moved somewhere south, Florida maybe Georgia. You have a number? No. We weren't friends, Silas. He called me once. I went to the morgue once, and I never heard from him again. Cora made a note on the legal pad she'd produced from her bag. I'll find him. If he's alive and drawing a pension, he's in a database somewhere. There's something else, Silas said. He lifted the helmet and turned it upside down. With a pocket knife, he carefully pried at the edge of the interior lining, the melted foam that had rehardened into that coral-like surface. Near the crown, where the foam met the shell, there was a small cavity. Not damage. Design. Someone had hollowed out a space approximately 2 inches square and sealed it with a material that matched the surrounding foam. I almost missed it, Silas said, but the weight was wrong. The helmet's too heavy for its size, and when I tapped the crown it sounded hollow in a spot where it shouldn't be. He reached into the cavity with 2 fingers and pulled out a small object wrapped in a strip of waterproof electrical tape. Everyone leaned in. Silas unwrapped it slowly. Inside was half a key. Brass. Cut cleanly down the center with a precision saw. The teeth on the remaining half were distinctive, a pattern that didn't match any standard door or padlock configuration. A locker key, Dutch said. It was the first complete sentence he'd spoken all evening. Half a locker key, Cora corrected. Where's the other half? Bishop asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew, but Silas was already thinking. He was remembering the way Ryder operated. The quiet systems, the layers, the way Ryder approached everything like a medic approaching a wound. Assess, stabilize, document. Ryder didn't do things by accident. If he hid half a key in a helmet, he hid the other half somewhere meaningful, somewhere personal, somewhere that connected back to who Ryder was, not just where Ryder had been. The chapel, Silas said. What chapel? Finch asked. The one on County Road 14. Ryder spent 2 years restoring it, donated his own money, did the carpentry himself. He said it was the only building in Ridgehaven that nobody owned and nobody wanted, and that was why it mattered. That place has been boarded up for years, Graves said. Exactly. Bishop looked at Silas for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed above them, casting shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move in a room with no wind. Before you go chasing keys and chapels, Bishop said, I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it without your fists. Silas waited. If Ryder staged his own death, if he chose to disappear, then he chose to let you grieve. He chose to let all of us grieve. He let Deacon carry the weight of identifying a body that might not have been his. He let you stand at a grave every October for 15 years. That was a choice, Silas. And if he had a reason for it, that reason better be carved in stone, because the cost of that choice is sitting in this room right now, and it's been bleeding for a decade and a half. The words landed like rounds, each one precise, each one center mass. Silas felt them in his chest, not as anger, not as grief, but as something worse, as the possibility that the man he'd loved like a brother had looked at him and decided that silence was more important than the truth, that protecting whatever secret Ryder was carrying was worth more than Silas's sanity, Deacon's marriage, Bishop's peace. That was the thought that could break him. Not that Ryder might be alive, not that someone might have killed him, but that Ryder might have chosen to let Silas drown in guilt for 15 years, because the alternative, trusting him with the truth, was somehow more dangerous. I hear you, Silas said. Do you? I hear you, Bishop, and I don't care. The old man's eyebrows rose. Not much, a millimeter. If Ryder's alive, I need to know why he ran. If he's dead, I need to know who killed him. Either way, I'm going to that chapel, and I'm finding the other half of that key, and I'm opening whatever door it leads to. And if what's behind that door burns down everything I thought I knew about the man, then I'll carry those ashes too. I've been carrying ashes for 15 years. What's a few more? Bishop held his gaze for 5 seconds. Then he looked at Cora. Can he do this without getting arrested? Depends on what he finds. Can he do it without getting killed? Depends on who's watching. Bishop looked at Graves. Put 2 riders on the girl's house, rotating, no contact. She doesn't see them, her grandfather doesn't see them, nobody sees them, eyes only. Graves nodded once. Finch, pull everything you can on Meridian Asset Recovery Group, corporate filings, property transfers, vehicle records. If that company touched Purcell's yard, I want to know every VIN that passed through those gates. Finch was already typing on his phone. Deacon. The man in the corner looked up. His eyes were red. The coffee in his mug had gone cold 3 conversations ago. You're going with Silas. Deacon opened his mouth. That's not a request, Bishop said. You carried this for 15 years alone. That ends tonight. You ride with Creed. You answer his questions, all of them. And if there's anything else you suspected, anything you noticed, anything that woke you up at 3 a.m. with your heart in your throat, you say it now, or you say it on the road. But you say it. Deacon stood. His body moved the way old injuries move, carefully, negotiating with pain that had become a permanent resident. He looked at Silas. The distance between them was 6 feet of concrete floor and 15 years of silence. I'm sorry, Deacon said. Silas didn't accept the apology. He didn't reject it either. He picked up the helmet, put it back in the duffel bag, and walked toward the door. Creed, Bishop called. Silas stopped. If someone out there has been erasing people for 15 years, they're not going to stop because you found a helmet. They're going to accelerate. Whatever they were managing slowly, they'll start managing fast. You understand what that means? Yeah. It means that girl is already on a clock, and she doesn't know it. Silas pushed the door open. The night air hit him like a wall. November cold, carrying the smell of diesel and dead leaves and the faint sulfur trace of the steel plant that still ran one shift, even though everyone in town knew it was dying. 8 motorcycles sat in the lot, their chrome catching the yellow light from a sodium vapor lamp that buzzed with the sound of insects that were too stubborn to die in the cold. He straddled his bike. The engine turned over with a sound that vibrated through his spine and into his teeth. Deacon climbed onto his own machine 2 spaces over. Neither looked at the other. They rode east toward County Road 14. The road was unlit once they passed the town boundary. No streetlights, no reflectors, just blacktop and tree lines and the headlights of their bikes cutting twin corridors through darkness so thick it felt like riding into a throat. 12 miles out, Silas's phone buzzed in his vest. A text from Finch. 2 words. Dale's gone. Silas pulled over. Deacon stopped beside him, engines idling, exhaust rising in white plumes against the black sky. What? Deacon said. Silas showed him the screen. Another text came through, then another. Finch typing in short, controlled bursts the way he always did when the news was bad and getting worse. Shop cleaned out. Safe emptied. Truck missing. Then someone beat us to him. Then Mara called the shop 10 minutes ago, said someone came to her house. White van. 2 men. Asked her grandfather about the helmet. Walt told them nothing. They left. Then the last message, the one that turned the cold night into something colder, something that crawled under Silas's leather jacket and wrapped around his ribs and squeezed. She says they knew her name. Silas stared at the screen. The words burned against the darkness. The engine beneath him throbbed like a second heartbeat, steady and mechanical and indifferent to the fact that somewhere in Ridgehaven, a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except refuse to walk past a broken thing was now standing in her kitchen realizing that the world she lived in had just developed teeth. He looked at Deacon. Deacon looked back. 15 years of silence and guilt and cold coffee and lost marriages hung between them, and none of it mattered now because the clock Bishop mentioned wasn't ticking. It was already running. Silas killed his headlight, turned the bike around, and opened the throttle toward Harker Street. Riding dark, riding fast, riding toward a girl whose name should have stayed in a junkyard log, but was now in the mouth of men in a white van who had come to a house on a dead street and asked questions that weren't questions at all, but measurements. Measuring how much she knew, how much she'd told, and how quickly she'd need to be erased the same way a burned helmet and a dead man's name and 15 years of truth had been erased before her. The night swallowed the sound of the engines, but it couldn't swallow what was coming. Silas killed the engine 2 blocks from Harker Street and rolled the bike silent into the shadow of a closed laundromat. Deacon pulled in beside him. Neither spoke. The cold was a living thing now. It moved through the gaps in their jackets, found skin, settled. Silas pulled his phone and texted Graves. Eyes on the house? The reply came in 4 seconds. Rider out front, girl and old man inside, lights on, no van. Silas exhaled. The vapor hung in the air between his face and the screen, then dissolved. He typed again. We're coming in on foot from the south. Don't spook her. He pocketed the phone and looked at Deacon. The man sat on his bike like a monument, motionless, thick, his eyes scanning the street with the mechanical sweep of someone trained to identify threats before they became casualties. Whatever Deacon had been carrying for 15 years was still there, but it had shifted position. It was no longer sitting on his chest. It was in his hands now, and hands could be useful. Stay behind me, Silas said. I'm not your prospect. I didn't say you were. I said stay behind me because that girl already trusts my face, and she's never seen yours, and right now she's scared enough to do something stupid if the wrong shadow walks up her porch. Deacon said nothing. He got off the bike and followed. They moved south along the alley behind Harker Street, past overturned recycling bins and a chain-link fence strangled by dead ivy. The houses here were small, single-story, built in the 1950s for steel workers and their families, and never updated because the families kept shrinking and the steel kept leaving. Most had porch lights that didn't work. The ones that did cast orange circles on cracked concrete, illuminating nothing useful. Mara's house was the 4th from the corner. A rider Silas recognized as Pike, young, quiet, a former Army scout who'd prospected in 3 years ago, sat on a bench across the street with a newspaper he wasn't reading. He caught Silas's eyes and tilted his head once toward the front door. All clear. Silas climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under his weight. Before he could knock, the door opened. Walt Ellison stood in the frame. He was holding a baseball bat. The old man's face was the color of concrete dust, gray, drawn, the tendons in his neck visible, like bridge cables under strain. His left hand gripped the bat at the base. His right hand trembled against the barrel. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned wrong, one tail hanging free, and his feet were bare on the cold linoleum. Mr. Ellison, Silas said, my name is Silas Creed. I spoke with your granddaughter this afternoon. I know who you are. She told me. Can I come in? You can tell me why 2 men in a white van knocked on my door 30 minutes ago and asked about a helmet my granddaughter brought home from a junkyard. That's why I'm here. Walt studied him. The bat didn't move. Behind Walt, in the hallway that led to the kitchen, Mara appeared. She was wearing the same boots, the same rubber-banded hair. Her face was calm in a way that Silas recognized, the forced calm of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Let him in, Grandpa. Mara, he's the only person who looked at that tag and told me the truth instead of telling me to forget. Walt held Silas's eyes for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside. The bat stayed in his hand. Silas entered. Deacon followed. Walt looked at the second man the way stray dogs look at strangers. All teeth assessment and distance calculation. Who's he? His name is Deacon. He knew the man that tag belonged to. The kitchen table still had the $300 on it, untouched, fanned out like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. A laptop sat open showing search results. 2 mugs of coffee had gone cold. The house smelled like reheated soup and fear. Fear has a smell, a metallic sharpness that sits above the ordinary odors of a room like a film on stagnant water. Mara sat down. She pulled the laptop toward her and turned it so Silas could see the screen. Meridian Asset Recovery Group, she said. I found the filing. Purcell's Yard is a subsidiary. Silas looked at the screen. The county business document was sparse. Incorporation date, registered agent, principal officer. The name listed as principal officer was not one he recognized. Victor Lane, Mara said. You know him? Silas felt Deacon stiffen beside him. Not a visible movement. A change in the air, a shift in weight, the kind of micro-adjustment that combat veterans make when their body registers a threat before their brain can name it. Deacon, Silas said without turning around. You know that name. Silence. Deacon. Yeah, I know it. Mara looked between them. Walt tightened his grip on the bat. Victor Lane donated the land for the Highway Fatality Memorial, Deacon said. He sat on the committee that approved the coroner's report after Ryder's crash. He signed off on the release of the body to the funeral home. He paused. Each sentence came out like a tooth being pulled. Reluctant, painful, leaving a gap where something important used to be. He also personally recommended the funeral home. The kitchen went silent except for the electric hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television playing in a house 2 doors down. He recommended the funeral home, Silas repeated. His voice was the temperature of the air outside. The funeral home that handled the closed casket. The casket you said felt wrong. Yes. What else? He paid for the funeral, out of his own pocket, called it a community service, said no veteran should be buried without dignity. Silas pressed his palms against the table. The wood creaked. His knuckles went white, then whiter, until the skin across them looked like paper stretched over stone. So the man who owned the salvage yard where the helmet was hidden, the man who sat on the committee that approved the coroner's report, the man who recommended the funeral home and paid for the funeral, that's the same man. Yes. And you knew this. I knew parts of it. I didn't put them together. You didn't put them together. Silas's voice dropped. Not in volume, in depth. It went somewhere below the register of normal conversation, into the space where words stop being communication and become pressure. A man runs the company that owns the yard, approves the death certificate, picks the funeral home, and pays for the casket, and you didn't put that together? It didn't look like that at the time. Lane was a name on a door. He was a businessman. He was on every committee, every board, every fundraising dinner. He was just there. The way wallpaper's there. You don't notice wallpaper until someone tells you it's covering a hole in the wall. Mara cut in. There's more. Everyone looked at her. I searched Meridian's vehicle transfer records through the county assessor's database. They file quarterly reports because they handle insurance salvage. In the last 15 years, Meridian has processed 412 motorcycles through Purcell's Yard. She turned the laptop again. The screen showed a spreadsheet she'd built from public data, columns of dates, VIN numbers, vehicle descriptions, disposition codes. Of those 412 bikes, 97 were flagged as total loss fire damage from highway accidents, all single-vehicle crashes, all on the same 50-mile stretch of interstate, and all 97 were crushed within 72 hours of arriving at the yard. Standard hold time for insurance inspection is 30 days. The number sat in the room like a grenade with the pin already pulled. 97, not 1, not 5. 97 motorcycles burned in crashes on the same stretch of highway, processed through the same yard, owned by the same man, and destroyed before anyone could inspect them. How many of those had fatalities? Cora Vance's voice came from the doorway. Nobody had heard her arrive. Nobody had heard the door open. She stood with her reading glasses on, her legal pad under her arm, and the expression of a woman who had just driven across town at 11 at night because Finch had called her with 2 words. It's worse. Mara checked her spreadsheet. I don't have fatality data. That's in the Highway Patrol database, and I can't access it. I can, Cora said. She sat down at the table without being invited, pulled out her own laptop, and began typing with the focused precision of someone who had spent 2 decades navigating public record systems that were designed to be navigated slowly. "Give me the date range." Mara gave it to her. 7 minutes of silence. Walt finally set the bat down against the wall. Deacon stood in the corner like a man waiting for sentencing. Silas didn't move from the table. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere between the coffee mugs and the cash, a point that didn't exist in the physical world, but occupied the exact center of the space where his understanding of the last 15 years was collapsing. Cora looked up from her screen. 31, she said. 31 what? Walt asked. 31 fatalities associated with motorcycle crashes on that stretch of interstate in the last 15 years. All single vehicle, all fire-related, all processed through Purcell's yard. She removed her glasses. Her eyes were steady, but her voice had developed an edge it didn't have when she walked in. "And I recognize 7 of the names." "Recognize them how?" Silas said. "From insurance litigation. 3 of them were subjects of wrongful death settlements, large ones. 6 and 7 figures. Settlements that were paid out to family members based on coroner's reports and highway patrol investigations that concluded the deaths were accidental." She closed her laptop slowly. The way you close a door on a room you're not sure you want to enter again. Settlements that were processed through insurance carriers who used Meridian Asset Recovery Group as their designated salvage contractor. The architecture of the conspiracy assembled itself in the silence that followed. Not all at once, not neatly, but in the jagged way that broken things reveal their original shape when you lay the pieces on a table. Someone was staging motorcycle fatalities. Real crashes, real fire, real wreckage, but not always real victims. The bikes were destroyed before inspection. The coroner's reports were approved by a committee that included the man who owned the salvage operation. The bodies were handled by a funeral home he selected. The insurance payouts were massive, and the salvage company that processed the evidence was a subsidiary of his own corporation. Ryder Knox hadn't died in a random accident. He had either been killed to maintain the operation because he discovered it, or he had faked his own death to escape it. Either way, the tag in Mara's pocket was the first piece of evidence in 15 years that had survived the system designed to destroy it. "We need to get to that chapel," Silas said. "Tonight." "You need to get that girl out of this house first," Cora said, looking at Mara. "If Lane's people knew to come here, they know her name, her address, and her connection to the helmet. That's 3 data points. 3 data points is a targeting package." "I'm not leaving my grandfather." "Your grandfather's coming too." Walt straightened. "Now, wait a minute. Mr. Ellison." Cora's voice was not loud. It was precise in the way that surgical instruments are precise, designed to cut exactly what needs cutting and nothing else. "2 men came to your door tonight. They didn't break in. They didn't threaten. They asked a polite question and left. Do you know why?" Walt said nothing. "Because they were measuring. They were seeing how much you know, how you react, and how hard you'd be to manage. That's reconnaissance, not intimidation. Intimidation comes next. And it won't be 2 men in a van. It'll be something quieter, something you won't see coming until it's already happened." The old man looked at his granddaughter. 17 years of raising her. 17 years of driving her to school and cooking dinner and sitting in hospital waiting rooms after her mother's overdose and filling out guardianship paperwork with hands that shook because the pen was asking him to accept that his daughter was gone and his granddaughter was his now, and the world was a machine that chewed up the young and the fragile and spat them out as obligations for the old and the tired. "Where?" Walt said. "My office," Cora said. "Downtown. Secured building, key card access, no windows on the ground floor. You'll be comfortable enough for one night." Mara stood. She picked up the $300 from the table and held it out to Silas. "I don't want your money." "It's not my money. It's yours. You earned it by finding that tag." "I didn't earn anything. I picked up a piece of scrap." "That piece of scrap might save lives, kid. Take the money, buy your grandfather new boots. His are worse than yours." Mara looked at Walt's feet, bare, swollen, the toenails thickened and yellow from decades of steel-toed boots and neglect. She pocketed the cash. She didn't say thank you. Neither of them needed her to. 20 minutes later, Mara and Walt were in Cora's car heading downtown. Pike followed at a 2-block distance on his bike, running without lights, a shadow trailing a shadow. Silas and Deacon rode east. County Road 14 was 11 miles of nothing, farmland that hadn't been farmed in years, fence posts rotting into the soil, and the occasional mailbox standing at the end of a driveway that led to a house with no lights. The chapel appeared on the left side of the road after a curve that Silas remembered from the dozens of rides he and Ryder had taken out here, rides that always ended at the chapel, where Ryder would spend 3 or 4 hours with a hammer and a saw and a level, rebuilding a structure that the county had written off as a liability and the community had forgotten. The building was small, white clapboard, most of it peeling, a simple A-frame roof with missing shingles. The front door was boarded over with plywood that had warped and split in the weather. 2 windows on each side, all covered. A gravel path led from the road to the entrance, overgrown with dead grass that crunched like bones under Silas's boots. He pulled the boards from the door with his hands. The nails came out of rotten wood like teeth from a skull. Easy, wrong, releasing a smell of damp and decay that rolled out of the dark interior like breath from a mouth that hadn't been open in years. Deacon held a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and found dust motes spinning in the disturbed air, cobwebs strung between the pews like gray curtains, and the floor, wide plank pine that Ryder had laid himself, board by board, sanding each one by hand because he said machines made everything look the same, and the point of restoring something was to let it keep its imperfections. Silas walked the center aisle. His boots left prints in the dust. Nobody had been inside this building in years, maybe a decade. The air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that comes from rooms that have been sealed so long they've forgotten what movement feels like. He stopped at the front. Behind the simple wooden podium Ryder had built, the wall was bare except for a single item. A small brass plate, tarnished nearly black, mounted at eye level. Silas rubbed the tarnish with his thumb. Letters appeared. Built by hands that needed building, Ryder's words. Ryder's philosophy, compressed into 6 words and screwed into a wall. Silas ran his fingers along the edges of the plate. It was mounted with 4 screws, but the bottom 2 were different from the top 2. Brass instead of steel, slightly larger, with Phillips heads instead of flatheads. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and removed the bottom screws. The plate swung upward on the top screws like a tiny door. Behind it, recessed into the wall, was a cavity roughly 3 inches deep. Inside the cavity, wrapped in the same waterproof electrical tape as the first half, was the other half of the brass key. Silas held the 2 halves together. They fit perfectly. The teeth aligned, the cuts matched. The key was whole. Deacon watched from 4 feet away, the flashlight steady in his hand despite everything else about him that was shaking. "He planned this," Deacon said. His voice was barely above a whisper. He planned all of it. The tag, the helmet, the key, the chapel. He set up a trail. A trail for who? For someone who cared enough to follow it. Silas closed his fist around the key. The brass was cold. The edges of the teeth bit into his palm. He squeezed until it hurt because the pain was simple and the hurt was physical, and both of those things were easier than the alternative. The realization spreading through his chest like ink and water that Ryder Knox had built an entire architecture of hidden evidence, had designed it to be found only by someone who knew him well enough to know where to look, and had then walked away from every person who loved him and let them believe he was dead. That was the betrayal. Not Deacon's silence, not Lane's corruption, not the system that staged crashes and burned evidence and paid out fraudulent settlements. The betrayal was Ryder's choice. The choice to protect the truth by sacrificing the people who would have helped him carry it. Silas pocketed the key. He walked out of the chapel without looking back. The night air hit him, and he breathed it in, cold, clean, smelling of dead grass and distant rain. His hands were shaking again. Not the fine tremor from the shop. This was different. This was the body's response to a tectonic shift, the physical expression of a foundation cracking. His phone buzzed. Finch. Found the locker. Old railway station on Vine, lockers still there. Station closed 8 years ago, but the building's intact. Property owned by county, unmonitored. Then a second message. Also found something on Lane. You need to see this in person. Come back to the shop. Silas looked at Deacon. We go to the shop first, Silas said. Then the station. What about the chapel? Should we secure it? There's nothing left to secure. Whatever Ryder hid, he hid in pieces. The chapel was just a step. They rode back. The wind had picked up, pushing against them from the east, carrying the first needles of freezing rain that stung exposed skin and turned the road surface into something between wet and frozen. Silas's hands ached inside his gloves. His knees ached from the cold. His chest ached from something that had no name and no cure and no interest in waiting for a more convenient time to destroy him. The shop was lit when they arrived. Finch stood in the bay with his laptop open on a workbench, his cigarette burned down to the filter, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has found something he wishes he hadn't. Talk, Silas said. Finch turned the laptop. On the screen was a newspaper archive, a local paper, the Ridgehaven Courier, dated 14 years ago. The article was short. A paragraph buried on page 6. The headline read, Local mechanic dies in workshop fire. The mechanic's name was Thomas Crane. He had worked at Purcell's yard. Okay, Silas said. Keep going. Finch clicked to another tab. Another article 12 years ago. Different paper. Ridgehaven man found dead in home. Natural causes. The man was a county records clerk named Paul Dresner, who had handled vehicle title transfers for the assessor's office. Another tab. 9 years ago. A retired highway patrol sergeant named Ben Waller, the same Waller who had called Deacon to identify Ryder's body, dead in his home in Savannah, Georgia. Cause of death listed as heart failure. He was 53. Another tab, 7 years ago. A former insurance adjuster named Karen Voss, found dead in her car in a parking garage in Columbus. Carbon monoxide, ruled accidental, faulty exhaust system. Another tab, 4 years ago. A volunteer firefighter named Jesse Riggins who had responded to Ryder's crash scene, drowned in a lake during a solo fishing trip. No witnesses. No autopsy requested by family. 5 deaths. 5 people connected to the chain of events surrounding Ryder Knox's disappearance. 5 deaths spread across 15 years. Each one plausible, each one unremarkable, each one occurring at a different time and in a different place. So far apart in geography and chronology that no pattern was visible unless you laid them on a timeline and drew lines between them. Finch had drawn those lines. On the workbench next to the laptop was a sheet of butcher paper covered in Finch's handwriting. Names, dates, locations, causes of death, connected by red ink lines that converged on a single point at the center of the page. Meridian Asset Recovery Group, and above it, in block letters, Victor Lane. He's been cleaning house, Finch said, slowly over years, removing anyone who touched the Knox case, anyone who could connect the crash to the salvage operation, anyone who might remember something or have a document or know a name. Silas stared at the butcher paper. 5 names, 5 deaths, each one designed to look like accident or nature or bad luck. The patience of it was what made his stomach turn. Not rage, not horror, but the mechanical, business-like efficiency of a man who treated human beings as line items on a ledger that needed to be zeroed out. And now a teenager walks into a diner with a tag that has Knox's name on it, Finch said. And suddenly the one piece of evidence he missed, the helmet, the tag, the key, is out in the open. 15 years of cleanup, and a 17-year-old girl with a magnet on a stick just undid all of it. Deacon leaned against the wall. His face had gone the color of ash. He was looking at the name Ben Waller on the butcher paper, the man who had called him to the morgue, who had stood beside him while he identified a body that might not have been Ryder's, who had filed the report and stamped the forms and then retired to Georgia and died alone in a house that smelled like whatever dying alone smells like. He was 53, Deacon said. Waller, he was in good shape. He ran marathons. Heart failure doesn't care about marathons, Finch said. That's the point. Every one of these is deniable. Every one of these has a plausible explanation. That's not luck. That's design. Silas pulled the completed key from his pocket and set it on the workbench next to the butcher paper. Two halves of brass, fitted together, the teeth aligned like the jaw of something that had been waiting 15 years to bite. "We go to the station tonight," he said. "Silas." Finch's voice carried a warning that wasn't quite a warning, more like the sound a bridge makes before it tells you it can't hold your weight anymore. If Lane has been erasing people for 15 years and he knows the helmet is out, and he knows Dale is gone, and he sent people to Mara's house, then he knows the clock is running. He's going to move. Whatever's in that locker, if he knows about it or even suspects it exists, he's going to try to get there first. Then we get there faster. Or we walk into something he's already prepared. Silas looked at Finch, then at Deacon, then at Graves, who had arrived silently during the conversation and now stood in the bay door with his arms crossed, rain beating on his leather vest, his face as communicative as a closed fist. "Graves, how many riders can you have at Vine Street in 30 minutes? 6. 8 if Dutch gets off the phone. Get them there. Nobody goes inside until I arrive. Nobody touches anything. Eyes on every entrance, every exit, every shadow that moves wrong." Graves nodded and was gone before the rain could finish deciding whether to fall on him. Silas picked up the key. He looked at the butcher paper one more time. Like 5 names, 5 deaths, 15 years of patience, and at the center of it all, a man who built memorials to highway fatalities while manufacturing the fatalities that filled them. His phone buzzed again. Cora. Mara and Walt secure. But the girl found something else on the laptop before I could stop her. She pulled insurance claim records from a public docket. "Silas, there are 31 claims, 31 staged deaths, and one of the insurance policies was taken out 3 weeks before Ryder's crash. Then, the beneficiary on Ryder's policy was changed 2 days before he died. The new beneficiary is a shell company, registered to Meridian." Silas read the message twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. They sat on the screen with the permanence of things that cannot be unread, cannot be unfelt, cannot be pushed back into the darkness they came from. Ryder's death had been worth money. His death had been planned. His death had been purchased in advance by the same man who approved the coroner's report, selected the funeral home, donated the memorial land, and spent 15 years killing anyone who might connect the dots. And now the dots were connected. Every single one. Drawn in red ink on butcher paper in a motorcycle shop in a dying steel town by men who had spent their lives being told they were the dangerous ones. The bikers, the outlaws, the men in leather who rode too fast and spoke too little and scared the neighbors. The dangerous one wore a suit, sat on the city council, smiled for cameras, shook hands at fundraisers, and built an empire on the ashes of people he burned. Silas put the phone in his pocket. He zipped his jacket to the throat. He pulled on his gloves. He walked to his bike in the rain and swung his leg over the seat and felt the engine come alive beneath him with a sound that was not comfort but was close. The sound of something mechanical and honest and incapable of deception. He looked at Deacon one last time. "You coming?" Deacon mounted his bike. The rain was falling harder now, turning the gravel lot into a mirror that reflected the shop lights in broken, shimmering fragments. "I've been coming for 15 years, Deacon said. "I just didn't know where I was going." They rode toward Vine Street, toward a locker that had been sealed for 15 years, toward whatever Ryder Knox had left behind, knowing that the man who had killed to keep it buried was now somewhere in the same city, in the same rain, making the same calculation he had made 31 times before. How quickly can this be erased? And for the first time in 15 years, the answer was, it can't. The old railway station on Vine Street had been dead for 8 years, but nobody had bothered to bury it. It stood at the end of a block where the streetlights had given up 3 administrations ago, a 2-story brick building with arched windows bricked over from the inside, and a loading platform that ran along the south wall like a concrete lip. The sign above the main entrance still read Ridge Haven Central in faded gold letters, each one peeling at the edges as if the words themselves were trying to leave. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, padlocked at the main gate with a county seal that had rusted into something that looked more like a wound than an official marker. Silas arrived to find 6 bikes already parked along the fence line, engines off, riders standing in the shadows like sentinels carved from wet leather and cold chrome. Graves had delivered. The men stood spaced at intervals, 2 at the main gate, 1 at each corner of the building, 2 more covering the alley that ran behind the loading dock. Nobody spoke. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the pavement into a black mirror that reflected the distant glow of a gas station 3 blocks south. Deacon pulled in behind Silas. They dismounted in silence. The key was in Silas's left jacket pocket, wrapped in a strip of cloth to keep the 2 halves pressed together. He could feel it against his ribs. Small, cold, heavy with everything it was about to unlock. Graves materialized from the shadow beside the gate. Rain ran down his beard in thin streams. His eyes moved across Silas's face, reading it the way he read everything. Quickly, accurately, without asking questions he could answer himself. "Building's dark," Graves said. "No vehicles, no foot traffic. Pike checked the perimeter twice. Back entrance is a steel fire door, rusted but functional. Main entrance is boarded. Loading dock has a roll-up door with a broken latch. That's our way in. Could be anyone's way in." "I know." Silas looked at the building. The rain blurred its edges, turned the brick into something soft and uncertain. But the structure was solid. Built in the 1930s when they built things to stand, not to sell. Ryder would have known that. Ryder would have chosen a building that would outlast him, outlast the people hunting him, outlast the patience of anyone trying to erase what he'd hidden inside. "Graves, you and 2 riders on the loading dock. Nobody comes in behind us. Deacon and I go in through the roll-up. Finch?" He turned. Finch was there, wet, smoking despite the rain, his phone in a waterproof case strapped to his forearm like a medic's tourniquet. "You stay at the gate. Anything moves on this street, car, van, person, shadow, you call it. And if it's not just a shadow, then you call it louder." They moved. The roll-up door on the loading dock was exactly as Graves described. A corrugated steel panel with a latch mechanism that had lost its fight with rust 2 winters ago. Silas gripped the bottom edge and lifted. The door rose with a groan that echoed through the empty building like a wounded animal waking up. He stopped it at chest height and ducked under. Deacon followed. Graves posted 2 riders at the opening and stepped inside, positioning himself 3 feet from the entrance with his back against the wall and his hand resting on the flashlight clipped to his belt. Inside, the station was a cathedral of abandonment. The main hall stretched 60 feet from the loading dock to the ticket windows on the far wall. The ceiling was high, 20 feet, maybe 25, supported by iron beams that had oxidized into a color somewhere between blood and rust. The floor was poured concrete, cracked in patterns that looked like river deltas seen from altitude. Water dripped from multiple points in the ceiling, each drip landing with a sound that multiplied in the emptiness until the whole building seemed to pulse with a slow, irregular heartbeat. The lockers were along the east wall. Silas saw them immediately. A bank of storage lockers, the old-fashioned kind with brass doors and combination locks, built into the wall in rows of 10. Most were open, doors hanging, interiors empty or filled with the debris of forgotten travelers. Newspapers from a decade ago, a single shoe, a paperback swollen with moisture until it was more sculpture than book, the smell of mildew and cold metal. He walked the row, reading the numbers stamped into each door. The key in his pocket had no number on it, just the teeth, the brass, and the waterproof tape. But railway locker keys were cut to match specific lock configurations, and the configurations were unique. 1 key, 1 lock. No duplicates. He started at the far end. Locker 1, tried the key. It didn't fit. Locker 2, same. 3, 4, 5. Each one a rejection, a small metallic refusal that echoed off the walls and came back sounding like the word no. Deacon stood watch behind him, flashlight sweeping the hall in slow arcs. The beam caught dust and rain mist and the occasional moth that had somehow survived inside the sealed building, its wings casting shadows that danced across the lockers like ghosts looking for their own doors. Locker 14, the key slid in. Not smoothly, 15 years of disuse had allowed corrosion to build in the cylinder, and the brass scraped against oxidized steel with a sound like a whisper delivered through clenched teeth. But it went in, and when Silas turned it, the mechanism yielded with a click that was louder than any sound he'd heard in years. The door swung open. Inside, stacked with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between evidence and garbage was organization, were the contents of Ryder Knox's last act. A leather journal, water-stained but intact, held closed with a rubber band that had fused to the cover. A manila envelope sealed with wax, not the decorative kind, the field expedient kind that medics use to waterproof supply manifests in the desert. Inside the envelope, visible through a tear in one corner, were photographs. A second envelope contained what looked like financial documents. Ledger pages, bank statements, transaction records. A third item sat at the bottom of the locker, a portable cassette recorder, the kind that reporters used before digital killed the format, with a tape inside and a second tape beside it, both labeled in handwriting that Silas recognized from 1,000 maintenance logs and duty rosters and late-night letters written by lamplight in places where the electricity was powered by generators and the silence was powered by fear. Ryder's handwriting, on the first tape. For Silas, if I'm gone. On the second tape, for the law, when the time comes. Silas stared at the tapes. His hands hung at his sides. He didn't reach for them. He stood in front of that locker, the way a man stands in front of a door he's not sure he should open. Not because he doesn't know what's on the other side, but because he's afraid he does. Take it all, Deacon said from behind him, and we can listen later. We need to move. Silas didn't move. Creed. He wrote my name on a tape, Silas said. His voice was flat, empty, scraped clean of everything except the raw fact of the sentence. He recorded something for me. He put it in a locker with a key he split in half and hid in 2 different places, and he wrote my name on it, and then he let me believe he was dead for 15 years. I know. Do you? Because I'm standing here trying to figure out which part of me is supposed to reach into that locker. The part that loved him or the part that wants to break this tape against the wall. Deacon stepped forward. He put his hand on the locker door. Not on Silas, not on the contents, just on the door. A point of contact that said, I'm here without asking permission and without offering comfort that neither of them knew how to give or receive. Take it all, Deacon said again. Be angry later, be broken later. Right now, be the medic. Assess, stabilize, document. That's what he trained us to do. That's what he'd want. Silas exhaled. The breath came out shaking. He reached into the locker and removed every item, placing them into the canvas duffel bag he'd carried the helmet in. The journal, the envelopes, the tapes, the recorder. Each item went in with the careful, deliberate movements of a man disarming ordnance, because that's what this was. 15 years of compressed truth packed into a space the size of a bread box, waiting for someone to open the wrong wire and let it detonate. He zipped the bag. He turned toward the exit. His phone vibrated. Finch. One word. Incoming. Silas grabbed Deacon's arm and pulled him away from the lockers, moving fast toward the loading dock. Graves was already at the roll-up door, his body pressed against the frame, looking out into the rain. His posture had changed, no longer relaxed vigilance, but coiled readiness. The difference between a man watching the road and a man watching the road because something is on it. 3 vehicles, Graves said. Coming south on Vine. Moving slow, no headlights. Silas reached the door and looked out. He could see them, 3 dark shapes moving through the rain, barely visible against the wet pavement. SUVs, large, the kind that corporate security firms used because they looked civilian until you noticed the reinforced bumpers and the blacked-out windows. They were rolling at maybe 15 miles an hour, the speed of a convoy that's looking for something and hasn't found it yet. They're sweeping, Silas said. Or they already know we're here and they're positioning. How many men? Can't tell. 3 vehicles. Figure 3 to 4 per vehicle, 9 to 12. 9 to 12 against 8 bikers in an abandoned railway station with one exit on the loading dock and a boarded main entrance. The math was bad. The terrain was worse. Inside the building, they were trapped. Outside the building, they were exposed. The only advantage they had was the fact that whoever was in those SUVs didn't know yet whether the locker had been opened, didn't know whether they were here to intercept or to clean up. "Get the bikes off the street," Silas said. Graves moved. Within 90 seconds, 6 motorcycles were rolled through the loading dock entrance and lined up inside the station, engines cold, chrome dulled by the darkness. The 2 riders from the gate brought in Silas's and Deacon's bikes and sealed the roll-up door, lowering it until only a 6-inch gap remained at the bottom, enough to see boots, tires, and headlight reflections on wet pavement. Through the gap, Silas watched the 3 SUVs stop. They parked in a loose triangle formation, one at the main gate, one at the south corner, one blocking the alley behind the building. Doors opened. Men stepped out into the rain. They were not police. Police announced themselves. Police use radios and flashlights and the specific body language of authority that comes from badges and training and the knowledge that the law is on your side. These men moved differently. They moved like contractors, efficient, silent, spreading into positions with the coordination of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Dark jackets, no visible badges, no uniforms. Some carried flashlights. At least 2 carried shapes that, in the rain and the dark, could have been tools or equipment cases but moved with the weight and balance of things designed to do harm. Silas counted. 11 men, 3 vehicles, 1 objective. His phone buzzed. Cora. "I called the field office. Federal investigators are on the way. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. An eternity measured in heartbeats. Silas typed back with one thumb, the other hand holding the duffel bag against his body. "We don't have 40 minutes. He looked at the men inside the station. Graves, Deacon, Pike. 4 others whose names were stitched on their vests. Harlan, Webb, Cutler, Royce. 8 men. Average age 43. 3 combat veterans. 2 former corrections officers. 1 former paramedic. 1 mechanic who had never been in a fight longer than a bar disagreement. And Deacon, who was 51 and carrying 15 years of guilt that had eaten his strength from the inside like acid in a fuel line. 8 men against 11. In the dark. In the rain. In a building with no power and 1 functional exit. Silas set the duffel bag on the floor and opened it. He pulled out the cassette recorder, inserted the tape labeled "For the Law," when the time comes, and pressed play. Ryder Knox's voice filled the railway station. It was a voice Silas hadn't heard in 15 years. A voice he'd replayed in his memory so many times it had worn smooth, lost its edges, become more feeling than sound. But the tape was real. The tape had texture. It had breath and hesitation, and the background noise of wherever Ryder had been sitting when he recorded it. A room with an echo. A fan running somewhere. The distant sound of traffic. "My name is Ryder Knox. I'm a member of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club out of Ridgehaven, Ohio. I'm recording this on October 11th because I believe I will be dead within a week, and I want there to be a record of why." Every man in the station stopped moving. 8 months ago, I was hired by a man named Victor Lane to perform maintenance on motorcycles processed through Purcell's Salvage and Recovery on Route 9. What I found was that the motorcycles being processed were not accident salvage. They were staged. The crashes were manufactured. The fire damage was applied after the fact using accelerant. I found residue consistent with industrial thermite on frame welds that should have shown impact damage, but showed none. The VIN plates had been transferred from other motorcycles. The insurance claims filed against these vehicles were fraudulent. The death certificates associated with the riders were issued by a county coroner who sits on a committee chaired by Victor Lane. The tape kept playing. Ryder's voice was steady. The medic's voice, the field report voice, the voice of a man who had learned that panic wastes time and time saves lives. He described the operation methodically, the insurance fraud scheme, the staged fatalities, the destruction of evidence through the salvage yard. The network of coroners, adjusters, funeral home operators, and law enforcement contacts who either participated willingly or were compromised through blackmail, bribery, or fear. He named names. He cited dates. He referenced documents that he said were stored alongside the recordings. I brought my findings to one person outside the club, a retired highway patrol sergeant named Ben Waller. Within 3 days, Waller told me he'd received a phone call warning him to forget our conversation. Within a week, my motorcycle's brake line was cut. I caught it during a routine inspection. If I hadn't, I'd be dead on the highway and my death would be the 32nd staged fatality in Victor Lane's ledger. Silas pressed pause. The silence that followed was absolute. 8 men standing in a dead building, their breath visible in the cold air, their faces lit only by the glow of Finch's phone screen coming through the loading dock gap. He knew, Deacon said. His voice broke on the second word. He knew they were going to kill him, and He didn't die, Silas said. He ran. He staged his own crash before they could stage it for him. He used their own method against them. Fire, wreckage, a body that couldn't be identified. He beat them to the punch. Whose body was in the casket? Nobody answered because the tape hadn't said. But the question hung in the air with the weight of a coffin lid, and every man in that station felt it land. Silas pocketed the recorder. The evidence was in the bag. The bag was on his back. Everything Ryder had built, the journal, the photographs, the financial records, the recordings, was now strapped to Silas's body. If it left this building, Victor Lane's empire collapsed. If it didn't, 31 families would never know the truth about how their loved ones died. And a man who built memorials to the people he murdered would continue building them. We need copies, Silas said, right now, before we move. Finch pulled out his phone. I can photograph the documents, record the tapes through the phone mic. It won't be clean, but it'll be admissible. Do it, fast. Finch work-egged. He photographed every page of the journal, every document in the envelopes, every photograph. He played both tapes through the recorder's tinny speaker and captured them on his phone's voice memo app. The quality was poor. Background hiss, room echo, the sound of rain on the roof competing with Ryder's voice. But the words were audible. The names were clear, the dates were correct. 7 minutes. That's how long it took to duplicate 15 years of hidden truth onto a device that fit in a man's pocket. Send copies to Cora, Silas said. Now. Everything. If this phone gets destroyed, if this bag gets taken, if every one of us walks out of here in handcuffs or body bags, the evidence survives. Finch sent. The upload bar crept across his screen. Slow, agonizingly slow, the cell signal fighting through the brick walls and the rain and the distance from the nearest tower. 40%, 60, 80. A flashlight beam swept across the loading dock gap. Everyone froze. The beam moved slowly, left to right, the methodical sweep of someone checking a building's exterior for points of entry. It paused on the roll-up door. The gap at the bottom, 6 inches of space between steel and concrete, suddenly became the most dangerous 6 inches in Ridgehaven, if the beam dropped, if the man holding the flashlight bent down, if he saw the line of motorcycle tires parked 4 feet from the door. The beam moved on. Finch's phone showed 92%. A voice outside, male, calm. The kind of calm that comes from authority, not from peace. Check the dock. Loading entrance. Footsteps on wet concrete, coming closer, heavy. The sound of boots that were built for work, not fashion. Steel-toed, rubber-soled. The kind worn by men who expected to walk through things that might bite back. 96%. The footsteps reached the roll-up door. A hand gripped the bottom edge. The steel creaked. The door began to rise. 100%. Upload complete. Silas looked at Graves. Graves looked at Silas. Between them passed an entire conversation in the space of a single heartbeat. A conversation about options, risks, consequences, and the specific calculation that men make when the difference between survival and catastrophe is measured in the actions of the next 3 seconds. Graves grabbed the door from the inside and shoved it upward. The man on the other side stumbled backward, flashlight spinning from his hand, his face registering the half-second of shock that separates expectation from reality. He was mid-30s, thick, wearing a tactical jacket with no insignia. His hand went to his hip. Something was clipped there, dark, angular, metallic. "Don't," Graves said. The word came out like a hammer strike, short, flat, final. Graves stood in the doorway, 6'2", 240, his silhouette filling the frame like a wall that had learned to speak. The man's hand stopped. His eyes moved past Graves into the dark interior of the station, counting the shapes behind him, calculating numbers, running the same math Silas had run 5 minutes ago, but arriving at a different answer because the equation looked different from the outside. "We're here for property," the man said. His voice was controlled, corporate, the voice of someone who had been briefed and compensated and told that this would be a simple retrieval. "Company property stored in this building. We have authorization from the property owner." "The county owns this building," Silas said, stepping forward. "And you're not the county. Step aside." "No." The man reached for his radio. "We have contact. East Side loading dock. Multiple individuals, armed, status unknown." The radio crackled. A voice replied, older, sharper, carrying the weight of command. "Hold position. We're coming around." Silas heard movement from both sides of the building. The triangle was collapsing inward. The three groups converging on the loading dock. 11 men narrowing their perimeter to a single point, the open mouth of the roll-up door where Graves stood like a monument, and 8 bikers stood behind him in the dark. "Everyone out," Silas said, not to the men outside, to his own. "Onto the platform. Stay visible. Stay in the light." "The hell," Pike started. "Trust me. Out. Now." They moved. 8 men stepping through the loading dock door onto the concrete platform, into the rain, into the glow of flashlights held by men who had not expected their targets to walk out voluntarily. The effect was immediate. 11 men with flashlights and tactical jackets suddenly found themselves facing 8 men who were not hiding, not running, not doing anything except standing in the rain with their hands visible and their eyes steady. Silas pulled out his phone. He held it up. The screen showed a live recording, video capturing every face, every jacket, every vehicle plate number visible in the flashlight beams. "You're being recorded," Silas said. His voice carried across the wet pavement with the clarity of a man who had spent years delivering information under conditions designed to make delivery impossible. Every face, every plate, every word. "This recording is being streamed live to an attorney's office downtown and copied to a federal server. Whatever you do next is evidence." The man in front, the one who had tried the door, looked at his colleagues. The calculation changed again. Corporate retrieval was one thing. Corporate retrieval captured on video and streamed to an attorney was something else entirely. "We have authorization. You have instructions from Victor Lane to retrieve the contents of a railway locker containing evidence of 31 staged motorcycle fatalities, an insurance fraud operation spanning 15 years, and the murder of at least 5 witnesses. That's not authorization. That's conspiracy." The man's jaw tightened. His hand moved away from his hip. Behind him, 2 of his colleagues exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that passes between men who have just realized they are standing on the wrong side of a line they didn't know existed until someone drew it in front of them. "We don't know anything about that." "Then you won't mind waiting for the federal investigators who are currently 23 minutes away." Silas held the phone higher. The rain hit the screen and ran down in streaks that caught the flashlight beams like tiny rivers of light. 23 minutes, that's all. You stand there. We stand here. Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt. And when the feds arrive, you tell them whatever Victor Lane told you about tonight, and let them decide whether you're a witness or an accomplice." Silence. Rain. The sound of engines idling somewhere. One of the SUVs left running, its exhaust plume rising into the night like a signal nobody was sending. The radio crackled again, the older voice. "Status?" The man in front lifted his radio slowly, his eyes never leaving Silas. "Situation is complicated." Define complicated. They have the material. They have recordings of us. They say federal agents are en route. A pause. Long enough for the rain to change direction. Long enough for Silas to count his own heartbeats and reach 11 before the voice came back. Pull back to vehicles, hold position. Wait for instructions. The 11 men retreated, not quickly, not in panic, in the slow, organized withdrawal of a unit that has been told to disengage, but not to leave. They returned to their SUVs but didn't drive away. Doors closed, engines ran, headlights stayed off. 3 dark shapes sitting in the rain, waiting. Silas lowered his phone. His arm was shaking, not from cold, from the controlled expenditure of adrenaline that had been building since he walked into that station and heard Ryder's voice for the first time in 15 years. That bought us time, Graves said. Not safety. I know. They're calling Lane. Lane's going to send more people or come himself. I know. And if he comes himself, this stops being a retrieval operation and starts being a war. Silas looked at the SUVs. 3 vehicles. 11 men. A corporate army deployed to protect a 15-year fraud that had killed 31 people and erased 5 witnesses and turned a dead man's name into a secret that was worth more than the lives it cost. It was always a war, Silas said. We just didn't know we were in it. Finch appeared at his shoulder. His phone showed a text from Cora. Files received. Forwarded to Federal Field Office. They're expediting. 15 minutes. Then a second message. Lane knows. His office called my office 4 minutes ago demanding to know my client's identity. I declined. He's moving. Then a third. Mara wants to come to the station. I told her no. She says the insurance records she found show 2 more shell companies connected to Meridian. She says one of them owns the funeral home that handled Ryder's casket. The other owns the tow company that transported the wreckage. Silas read the messages. Each one added a brick to the wall that was closing around Victor Lane, a wall built from documents and recordings and photographs and the stubborn, relentless work of a 17-year-old girl who had picked up a piece of scrap metal because she couldn't walk past broken things. He texted back, "Keep Mara there. Keep her safe. When the feds arrive, give them everything." He put the phone away. The rain was easing now, thinning from sheets to curtains, to individual drops that fell with the kind of deliberate spacing that made each one audible on the concrete platform. The air smelled like wet iron and diesel and the particular electric charge that comes before something changes permanently. Headlights appeared at the end of Vine Street. Not the SUVs, something else. A single vehicle moving fast, its high beams cutting through the rain with the arrogance of a machine that expected the road to clear for it. A black sedan, late model, the kind of car that cost more than Mara's house and Walt's truck, and every piece of scrap she dragged out of Purcell's yard in a year combined. It stopped behind the SUVs. The driver's door opened. Victor Lane stepped out. Silas had never seen the man in person. He'd seen the billboards, the television commercials, the newspaper photos from city council meetings and charity galas. But the man who stepped out of that sedan and stood in the rain on Vine Street was not the man from the billboards. The billboard version was polished, smiling, a civic leader with capped teeth and a handshake that had been optimized for cameras. The man standing in the rain was something else. He was 60, thin, wearing a dark overcoat that absorbed the water without showing it. His face was narrow, angular, built around cheekbones that looked like they'd been installed rather than grown. His eyes moved across the loading dock, across the bikers standing on the platform, across the flashlight beams and the phone screens and the chrome of the motorcycles visible through the open door, and his expression didn't change. It didn't need to. His expression was his expression, the permanent, practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 30 years building something on a foundation of ashes and had never once flinched at the smell of smoke. He walked toward the platform. His security team moved with him, not in formation, but in the loose gravitational orbit of men who had been paid to stay close. He stopped 10 feet from Silas. "Mr. Creed," he said. He knew the name. Of course he did. He'd known it since the moment Mara walked into the shop with a helmet. Maybe longer. Maybe he'd known it for 15 years. known the name of the man who visited Ryder Knox's grave every October, the man who would have torn the world apart to find the truth, if only he'd known there was truth left to find. "Lane," Silas said, "you have something that belongs to my company. I have something that belongs to 31 dead people, and 5 more who died keeping it hidden. You have stolen property removed from a storage facility without authorization. I'm prepared to resolve this civilly. Return the materials. Walk away. No charges, no consequences. No consequences." Silas repeated the words the way you repeat something obscene, slowly, tasting each syllable, letting the poison of it sit on your tongue before you spit it out. Ryder Knox, Thomas Crane, Paul Dresner, Ben Waller, Karen Voss, Jesse Riggins. Those are consequences, Lane. Those are people you erased because they stood between you and the money you made off their deaths. Lane's expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a crack. The neutrality held. A mask so perfectly fitted that it had become the face, and the face beneath it had been forgotten so long ago that even Lane himself might not remember what it looked like. "I don't know those names," he said. "You will, because every one of them is on a tape, recorded by a man you tried to kill 15 years ago. A man who was smarter than you, more patient than you, and more willing to sacrifice than you will ever understand. And that tape is not in my bag, Lane. It's on a server. It's in an attorney's office. It's in the hands of federal investigators who are—" He checked his phone. 9 minutes away. For the first time, something moved behind Lane's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the precursor to fear, the recognition that the architecture he'd built, the careful, patient, methodical structure of silence and destruction and financial control, was being disassembled by men who didn't care about money, and a girl who didn't care about power, and a dead man's voice playing from a cassette tape in a building that smelled like rust and rain. 9 minutes is a long time, Lane said. Not long enough for what you're thinking. You don't know what I'm thinking. I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking about the same thing you thought about 31 times before. How quickly can this be erased? Silas took 1 step forward. The rain fell between them like a curtain that neither of them could close. It can't. Not this time. Not anymore. The evidence is out of your reach. The names are on the record. And every second you stand here is another second on a video that federal prosecutors are going to watch in a courtroom while 31 families sit behind you and listen to every word. Lane looked at Silas for a long time. The rain ran down his face, and he didn't wipe it. He stood in it the way a man stands in something he can't control, rigidly, resentfully, with the posture of someone who has never been wet before and considers it a personal insult. Then he turned to the man nearest him, the one from the loading dock, the one who had tried the door, the one whose hand had moved toward his hip. "Get the bag," Lane said. The man hesitated. He looked at the bikers on the platform. 8 men standing in the rain, soaked, exhausted, but standing, their eyes carrying the particular light of people who have decided that the next person who moves toward them will learn something about the cost of that movement. "Sir, get the bag." The man took 1 step forward. Graves stepped down from the platform. 1 step, that was all. 1 step onto the wet pavement, putting his body between the approaching man and Silas. And the sound his boot made when it hit the concrete was the loudest sound on Vine Street. Louder than the rain, louder than the idling engines, louder than the heartbeat hammering in Silas's ears. "Try," Graves said. The man stopped. And then, distant, growing, cutting through the rain and the silence and the standoff, the sound of sirens. The sirens came from the west, cutting through the rain like blades through wet cloth. 3 vehicles, 2 unmarked sedans, and a federal SUV with emergency lights mounted behind the grille, blue and red strobing against the brick face of the railway station and turning the wet pavement into a shifting mosaic of color that made everything look like it was underwater. Victor Lane didn't run. Men like Lane didn't run. Running was an admission, and admission was a currency he had never traded in. He stood in the rain and watched the federal vehicles park, and watched the agents step out. 4 of them, wearing windbreakers with letters on the back that needed no introduction. and his face maintained its neutrality the way a dam maintains its surface, while the pressure behind it reaches the point where physics stops being theoretical and becomes catastrophic. The lead agent was a woman named Hargrove, mid-40s, short hair plastered to her forehead by the rain. She moved with the economy of someone who had conducted enough field operations to know that the first 30 seconds determined everything: tone, compliance, the psychological architecture of who was in control and who was pretending to be. "Victor Lane?" she said. "I'd like to speak with my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity. Right now I need you to step away from these individuals and stand by my vehicle." "On what basis?" Hargrove didn't answer immediately. She looked past Lane at the bikers on the platform. 8 men, soaked, standing in formation without having been told to form one, their vests dark with rain, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who have been holding a line for longer than their bodies wanted to hold it. She looked at the 11 men from the SUVs, most of whom had retreated to their vehicles the moment the federal lights appeared, their professional composure dissolving into the individual calculations of men who had just realized their employer was about to become the subject of a conversation they did not want to be part of. "We received materials from an attorney representing these individuals," Hargrove said. "Recordings, documents, photographs, financial records. Those materials describe an ongoing criminal enterprise involving insurance fraud, evidence destruction, and multiple suspicious deaths spanning 15 years. We're here to secure the scene, preserve evidence, and begin a preliminary investigation." "Those materials were stolen from a private storage." "Sir, step to the vehicle." Lane's jaw tightened. The mask slipped. Not much, not completely, but enough. A fracture line ran through the neutrality, and what showed underneath was not fear or anger, but something colder. Contempt. The specific contempt of a man who had spent 30 years being the smartest person in every room and was now standing in the rain being told to step aside by a woman in a windbreaker. He stepped aside. 2 agents escorted him to the federal SUV. He went without resistance. His overcoat was black with rain. His shoes, Italian leather, $200 minimum, were ruined. He sat in the back seat of the vehicle with his hands on his knees, and through the rain-streaked window Silas could see his face illuminated by the dashboard instruments, and the face was already working, already calculating, already building the next structure, the legal defense, the PR strategy, the narrative that would explain everything as a misunderstanding, a vendetta, a disgruntled biker's fantasy. But the tapes were real. The documents were real. Ryder's voice on the cassette was real. And 31 names on 31 fraudulent insurance claims were real in a way that no attorney or PR firm could make unreal. Hargrove approached Silas on the platform. She carried herself with the careful balance of someone who understood she was standing between 2 groups of men who had been seconds from violence and needed to be managed differently than suspects or witnesses or civilians. "You're Silas Creed?" "Yeah." "Your attorney, Cora Vance, has been in contact with our office. She's provided a comprehensive package of materials that she says were recovered from a storage locker inside this building." "That's correct. I need to secure those original materials as evidence. Do you have them?" Silas looked at the duffel bag on his shoulder. Ryder's journal, Ryder's photographs, Ryder's recordings, Ryder's handwriting on labels that said, "For Silas, if I'm gone." 15 years of a dead man's last act, packed into canvas and carried through a rainstorm by a man who had just learned that the brother he grieved had orchestrated his own disappearance to protect evidence that could have destroyed an empire. He handed the bag to Hargrove. Letting go of it was harder than he expected, not because of the evidence, because of the tapes. Because of the journal, because somewhere in those pages and those recordings was the version of Ryder Knox that Silas had been carrying in his memory for 15 years, the version that died on a highway on a Tuesday night in October. And once the evidence went into federal custody, that version would be replaced by the real one, the one who ran, the one who hid, the one who chose the truth over the people who loved him. Hargrove took the bag. She handed it to another agent who placed it in an evidence container in the SUV's trunk. She made a note on a clipboard. The bureaucracy of justice. Slow, methodical, indifferent to the emotional weight of the objects it processed. We'll need statements from everyone here, she said. Tonight, if possible. Can it wait until they're dry? Silas said. Hargrove looked at him. Something moved behind her professional exterior. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone who had seen enough broken people to know when she was looking at another one. We'll set up at the field office. There's coffee. There's always coffee. The next 4 hours existed in the fluorescent purgatory of a federal field office on the third floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Each biker gave a statement. Each statement was recorded. Each recording became part of a file that would grow over the coming weeks into something massive. A case file measured in boxes, not pages, documenting the systematic destruction of evidence, the staging of fatal accidents, and the financial architecture of an insurance fraud operation that had generated over $40 million in fraudulent settlements across 15 years. Silas gave his statement last. He sat in a gray chair at a gray table in a gray room and spoke for 90 minutes. He told them about Ryder, about the tag, about Mara, about the helmet and the key and the chapel and the locker and the tapes. He told them about standing at a grave every October and talking to a stone and never knowing the stone was lying. He told them about Deacon's silence and Bishop's wisdom and graves stepping off a platform to stand between a girl's evidence and a man paid to destroy it. When he finished, the agent who had been taking notes, a young man with the careful handwriting of someone who had been taught that legibility was a form of respect, looked up. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Silas thought about it, about the things the statement didn't capture. The sound of Ryder's voice on the tape, the weight of the helmet in his hands, the way Mara had looked at him in the shop, 17 years old, wearing boots that didn't fit, holding a dead man's name in her pocket, refusing to be scared because being scared was a luxury her life had never offered. "No," he said, "that's everything." It wasn't, but some things don't fit in statements. Dawn came the way dawn comes in the Midwest in November, reluctantly dragging itself above the horizon like a man who doesn't want to get out of bed, spreading a thin gray light across a town that looked exactly the same as it had looked the night before, except that everything was different. The rain had stopped. The streets were wet. The air smelled like ozone and cold concrete and the particular freshness that follows a storm, as if the atmosphere had rinsed itself and was temporarily embarrassed by how dirty it had been. Silas sat in a diner on 4th Street, the same diner where Mara had held up the tag 3 days ago and turned the world inside out. He sat in a booth by the window with a cup of coffee he'd been holding for 20 minutes without drinking. The coffee had gone from hot to warm to something that was approaching room temperature with the inevitability of all things that are left alone too long. Deacon sat across from him. Neither had spoken since leaving the field office. They had ridden here in silence, parked their bikes side by side, walked in and sat down and ordered coffee from a waitress who looked at their rain-stained vests and exhausted faces and had the grace to say nothing except regular or decaf. Regular, because decaf was a lie, and they'd had enough lies for one lifetime. The diner was nearly empty, a trucker at the counter eating eggs, a night shift worker from the bottling plant reading a newspaper. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that Silas had never noticed before, but that now seemed like the only sound in the world, a constant low-grade vibration that filled the silence the way water fills a hole, not because it wants to, but because that's what silence is for. "He might still be alive," Deacon said. Silas looked up from his coffee. "Ryder. The tapes prove the crash was staged. If he staged it himself, if he ran before Lane could kill him, then there's no proof he's dead. There's no proof he's alive either, but the possibility exists." Silas had thought about this. During the statement, during the ride, during the 20 minutes of staring into coffee that was losing its warmth the way everything loses its warmth when you hold it too long without drinking. The possibility that Ryder Knox was somewhere, breathing, eating, sleeping, living under a name that wasn't his in a place that wasn't home, was a thought he could not yet accommodate. It was too large for the space inside his chest. It pressed against his ribs and his lungs and the place behind his sternum where grief had lived for 15 years, and the grief did not want to move. Grief never wants to move. It puts down roots. It builds walls. It becomes the architecture of who you are, and removing it means removing pieces of yourself that you've grown around like a tree grows around a fence post, incorporating the foreign object until it becomes structural. If he's alive, Silas said, he'll surface. The case will be public. His name will be in the news. If he's out there, he'll know it's safe. And if he doesn't surface, then he has his reasons, and I'm done guessing at other people's reasons. Deacon nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank. It was cold. He drank it anyway, the way soldiers drink things that are no longer what they were supposed to be, without complaint, without comment, because the act of drinking matters more than the temperature of what you're drinking. The door opened. Mara walked in. She was wearing the same boots, the same rubber-banded hair, but something about her was different. Not her appearance, but her posture. She stood straighter, not dramatically, a degree, 2 degrees. The kind of shift that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and then setting it down and realizing your spine remembers what it felt like before the weight. Walt was behind her, moving slowly, his left foot dragging the way it always did, his hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket that was too thin for November. But he was there, upright, present. An old man who had walked into a federal field office at 1 a.m. with a baseball bat. He'd refused to leave in the car and given his own statement about 2 men in a white van who had come to his door and asked about a helmet and received nothing from him except the specific silence of a 71-year-old steelworker who had learned decades ago that the most powerful thing you can say to a man who wants information is absolutely nothing. Mara slid into the booth next to Silas. She didn't ask permission. She sat down the way you sit down in a place where you've earned the right to sit. Cora says the feds are executing search warrants at Meridian's offices this morning, Mara said. They're also pulling records from the funeral home and the tow company. Good. She says they'll likely open investigations into all 31 death claims. That means exhumations, dental record comparisons, forensic reviews of every crash site. Silas looked at her, 17 years old. Talking about exhumations and forensic reviews the way other 17-year-olds talked about homework and parties, not because she was hardened, because she was present, because she had walked into a situation that should have been too big for her and had refused to shrink herself to match anyone's expectations of what a teenager should be able to handle. You should eat something, Silas said. I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said you should eat something. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. It was the first thing resembling a smile that Silas had seen on anyone in 3 days. It lasted less than a second, but it left a mark the way light leaves a mark on film, an impression that proved something existed even after it disappeared. She ordered toast. Walt ordered eggs. Silas ordered a refill he didn't intend to drink. Deacon ordered nothing and sat with his empty cup like a man who had learned that sometimes the right thing to hold is a vessel with nothing in it. The morning developed slowly. More bikers arrived. Graves came in and took a stool at the counter without ordering, his presence enough to fill the empty space beside the trucker. Finch appeared with his phone plugged into a portable charger, his eyes red from sleeplessness and screen light, his fingers still carrying the faint smell of cigarette smoke that clung to him like a second skin. Pike sat on the bench outside the window, his face turned toward the street, watching because watching was what Pike did, and being told to stop was not something anyone had tried. They didn't crowd the booth. They didn't make speeches. They occupied the diner the way they occupied the world. Quietly, solidly, taking up space without performing the act of taking up space. They were there because Mara was there, and Walt was there, and Silas was there. And the thing they had built over 3 days was not a plan or a strategy or a mission, but something older and simpler. A perimeter. A ring of presence around 2 people who had been alone for a very long time and were now, for the first time, enclosed by something that was not a wall but a circle, not a barrier, but an embrace made of leather and exhaust fumes, and the kind of silence that men share when they have been through something together and don't need to talk about it because the talking would make it smaller than it actually was. 2 weeks later, Silas rode out to Purcell's yard. The gates were chained with federal evidence tape, yellow plastic, fluttering in the wind, stamped with case numbers and agency identifiers. The office trailer was sealed. The crusher was silent. The 3 acres of compressed vehicles sat in the cold like a graveyard of machines, each one holding its secrets inside rusted panels and shattered glass. The feds had found records, extensive records. Dale Purcell, who was located 4 days after his disappearance in a motel room in Wheeling, West Virginia, sitting on the edge of a bed he hadn't slept in, staring at a television he hadn't turned on, had cooperated immediately. He'd been running the yard as Meridian's disposal point for 15 years, destroying evidence on a schedule, crushing vehicles before insurance inspectors could examine them, shredding paperwork that connected the crashes to the fraud operation. He did it because Lane paid him, and because Lane had shown him once what happened to people who stopped being useful: a photograph of Thomas Crane's workshop after the fire, a photograph that Dale had kept in his safe for 15 years like a talisman of terror, a reminder that the alternative to compliance was combustion. Victor Lane was arrested on 23 federal counts: insurance fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, evidence tampering. The murder charges would take longer. Building a homicide case on deaths that had been ruled accidental or natural required the kind of forensic reconstruction that measured time in months, not days. But the financial case was immediate and devastating. $41 million in fraudulent insurance payouts, traced through a network of shell companies that all terminated at Meridian Asset Recovery Group, which terminated at Victor Lane, who terminated at a cell in a federal detention center where the coffee was worse than the diners, and the silence was a different kind entirely. The funeral home operator cooperated. The tow company owner cooperated. 2 of the 11 men from the SUVs cooperated, providing testimony about the instructions they'd received on the night of the station confrontation, instructions that explicitly directed them to recover and destroy evidence. Each cooperation added another brick to the wall. Each brick made the next cooperation easier, because the math of criminal conspiracy is simple. The first one to talk gets the best deal, and everyone after that gets what's left. Families were contacted. 31 families who had been told their loved ones died in unavoidable accidents. Highway crashes, mechanical failures, the random cruelty of speed and fire and physics. Some had suspected, most hadn't. The grief they'd carried was real, even if the stories they'd been told were not, and the revelation that their pain had been manufactured, that someone had profited from their loss, had calculated the dollar value of their loved one's death and filed paperwork to collect it, produced a second grief that sat on top of the first like a layer of ice on a frozen lake, transparent but impossible to break through without cutting yourself. Insurance settlements were reopened. Wrongful death cases were re-examined. The memorial that Lane had donated, the one built on land he'd purchased with the proceeds of the deaths it commemorated, was closed pending an investigation into whether the names engraved on its surface included people whose deaths he'd arranged. The irony was not lost on anyone, but irony doesn't comfort the bereaved. It just makes the wound symmetrical. In December, the county announced that Purcell's yard would be permanently closed and the property transferred to a nonprofit organization. The plan was to convert it into a training center for volunteer search and rescue teams, a place where people could learn to find things that had been lost, to recover things that had been hidden, to bring back what the world had tried to erase. The symbolism was obvious. The need was real. Both of those things could be true at the same time. Mara Ellison received a letter in January. It came from a university 2 states away, a school with an engineering program that specialized in forensic analysis, the science of determining how things break and why, and whether the breaking was natural or deliberate. The letter offered a full scholarship. It cited her exceptional investigative aptitude and demonstrated commitment to evidence-based inquiry, which was the academic way of saying she'd pulled a burned helmet out of a junkyard and used it to dismantle a 15-year criminal enterprise before her 18th birthday. She read the letter at the kitchen table on Harker Street. Walt sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, the same posture, the same kitchen, the same man who had told her to let it go 3 weeks earlier and had watched her refuse, and had been terrified and proud in equal measure ever since. "You going?" Walt said. "I'm going." "Good." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The word good, delivered in the kitchen of a house that smelled like coffee and liniment, and the particular warmth of rooms where the windows had finally been opened, carried everything. The fear he'd felt when the van came, the pride he'd felt when she refused to stop, the grief he carried for a daughter who hadn't survived her own storms, and the relief of knowing that this girl, his girl, the one he'd raised on scrap money and bus fare and the honest detector that never lied, was going to be fine. More than fine. She was going to be the person who walked into rooms full of broken things and figured out why they broke. 3 days before Mara left for school, Silas came to the house on Harker Street. He arrived on his motorcycle, the engine cutting through the February cold with the steady rhythm that Mara had come to associate with the man. Unhurried, persistent, present. He carried the helmet. Not the burned, shattered ruin she'd pulled from the junkyard. The helmet had been restored. Not rebuilt. Restored. The distinction mattered. Rebuilding meant making something new. Restoring meant honoring what it had been while giving it what it needed to survive what came next. Silas had replaced the visor, repaired the shell, relined the interior with new foam that matched the original specification. The burn scars remained. He hadn't hidden them, hadn't painted over them, hadn't pretended the fire never happened. The scars were part of the story, and removing them would have been another kind of erasure. The aluminum tag hung from the chin strap. It had been straightened, polished, the hand-carved letters Knox visible and clear. But there was something new beside the tag. A second tag, smaller, stamped by machine attached with a fresh clip. It read, Ellison. Silas handed the helmet to Mara on the porch. Walt watched from the doorway. The afternoon light was thin and gold, the kind of winter light that doesn't warm anything but makes everything it touches look like it matters. This doesn't belong to the past anymore, Silas said. Mara took the helmet. She held it the way she held everything. Carefully, the way people hold things when they understand that objects carry more weight than their materials account for. She ran her thumb over the Knox tag, then over the Ellison tag, feeling the difference between hand-carved and machine-stamped, between a name hidden in fire and a name given in daylight. "He's not coming back, is he?" Mara said. She wasn't asking about whether Ryder was alive. She was asking about what Silas had decided, what he had built inside himself over the past weeks to replace the 15 years of grief that had been demolished by the truth. She was asking whether the man in front of her was still waiting. "No," Silas said. "He's not. Wherever he is, whatever he decided, the evidence did what he needed it to do. That was the point. Not the reunion, not the homecoming. The point was making sure the truth outlasted the people trying to bury it. That's not enough. It's what we've got." Mara looked at the helmet, at the burn scars that Silas had chosen to keep, at the tag that bore a dead man's name beside her own. "My mom used to throw things away," she said. Her voice was quiet, not sad, observational, the way you describe weather or geography, things that exist independent of your feelings about them. When something broke, she threw it out. Didn't matter what it was. Toaster, lamp, chair. If it was broken, it was garbage. I used to dig stuff out of the trash and try to fix it. She'd get mad. She'd say I was wasting time on junk. She looked at Silas. I wasn't wasting time. I was learning that broken things still have a shape. They still have a purpose. They just need someone who can see past the damage. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was standing on a porch in February holding a helmet that had been buried under a truck in a junkyard, burned in a fire that was supposed to erase a man's existence, hidden for 15 years by people who believed that destruction was permanent, and carried into daylight by a girl with a magnet on a stick who had looked at a piece of scrap metal and seen something worth saving. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter, handwritten, the ink slightly smeared from being read multiple times. Ryder's letter, the one from the locker. The sealed one addressed to Silas. He'd read it alone, in his shop, at 2 a.m, sitting on the stool where he'd been sitting when Mara first walked in with the helmet. The letter was short. Ryder had never been a man who used 10 words when 3 would carry the weight. "I want you to read something," Silas said. He handed her the letter. Mara unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as the tag, rough, direct, carved into the page with the pressure of a man who wrote the way he lived, pressing hard enough to leave a mark. One sentence. "If this tag ever reaches you, it means someone refused to walk past broken things." Mara read it twice. She folded the letter and handed it back to Silas. Her eyes were dry. She was not the kind of person who cried at sentences, no matter how much the sentences deserved it. She was the kind of person who took sentences and turned them into actions, who heard words and converted them into the fuel that powered the engine that drove her forward through a world that had given her newspaper-stuffed boots and a scrap magnet and a grandfather who loved her and absolutely nothing else. "He wrote that for you," Mara said. "Not for me. He wrote it for whoever found the tag. That was you. I just picked up a piece of metal." "Yeah, and then you didn't put it down." She put the helmet on. It fit. Not perfectly. Her head was smaller than a combat medic's, and the restored foam had been shaped for a different skull. But it sat on her head the way purpose sits on a person, slightly too big, slightly uncomfortable, but undeniably present. Silas looked at her, 17 years old, wearing a dead man's helmet with her own name hanging beside his, standing on the porch of a rented house on a street where the streetlights worked on alternating blocks, in a town that had lost its steel and its certainty, and most of its reasons for optimism, looking at a biker who had spent 15 years talking to a gravestone, and 3 weeks learning that the gravestone was the most honest thing in a landscape built on lies. "Take care of that helmet," he said. "I will. And take care of your grandfather." "I always do." He walked to his bike. The engine started on the first kick. It always did, because Silas maintained his machines the way Ryder had maintained that chapel, with the belief that some things deserve to keep running even when the world around them has stopped. He rode west, toward the shop, toward the workbench where the magnifying loupe still sat beside the notebook with the identification codes of every Iron Saints member going back 30 years. Toward the bay doors that Graves had closed the night everything changed, and that now stood open, letting February air and thin sunlight into a space that smelled like engine grease and cold metal, and the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, but occupied the exact space where grief used to live. Behind him, on the porch of the house on Harker Street, Mara Ellison took off the helmet and held it in her hands and looked at the 2 tags hanging from the strap. Knox and Ellison. Aluminum and aluminum, one carved by a dead man's knife and the other stamped by a living man's machine, swinging together in the winter air like 2 halves of a key that had finally been made whole. She went inside. She set the helmet on the kitchen table next to her acceptance letter and her grandfather's coffee mug and the laptop she'd used to unravel a 15-year conspiracy with public records and a broadband connection that cut out every time the wind blew. Walt looked at the helmet. He looked at his granddaughter. "You did good, kid." "I found a piece of metal, Grandpa." "Yeah, and then you didn't let go." Outside, the sound of Silas's motorcycle faded down Harker Street, turned left on the avenue, and disappeared into the distance. A low, steady vibration that thinned and softened and finally merged with the ordinary sounds of a town waking up on a cold morning. Cars starting, doors opening, a dog barking 3 blocks over, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the world going on the way worlds go on after the truth comes out, not with fanfare, not with resolution, not with the clean ending of a story told by someone who wasn't there, but with the quiet, persistent, unremarkable continuation of people doing what they've always done, getting up, making coffee, opening the door, and walking out into whatever the day has built for them. The aluminum tags swung gently from the helmet strap, catching the kitchen light and throwing 2 small bright spots onto the ceiling, tiny, moving, alive. What once represented loss had become proof that even forgotten pieces of wreckage can carry the truth home.